You've been told that when someone leaves, what you feel is that you miss them. That the ache in your chest means the person themselves is the source of the emptiness. That the reason their name still appears in your mind during quiet moments is because they were the one thing your life truly needed. But if that were completely true, something wouldn't quite make sense. Why does the mind return more to the feeling than to the person? Why do you remember the warmth, the calm, the sense of being understood far more vividly than the real conversations, the flaws, and the ordinary moments that actually made up the relationship? Why does the heart hold on to an atmosphere more than the individual who was inside it? The truth is something most people are never taught. You don't miss them. You miss the feeling. You miss the emotional world your mind created when they were there. The sense of comfort, the quiet relief, the small moments when life felt lighter and more meaningful. For thousands of years, Buddhist thinkers observed the human mind with incredible attention, and they noticed something remarkable about attachment. People rarely cling to individuals themselves. Instead, they cling to the feelings those individuals seem to produce. The peace, the excitement, the emotional safety, the sense that everything in life suddenly made a little more sense. And when the person disappears, the mind quietly assumes the feeling disappeared with them. It begins to believe that happiness lived inside that person, that calm belonged to them, that the warmth you experienced could only exist when they were present. But this belief is an illusion. Feelings do not live inside other people. They arise inside the mind through conditions, memories, expectations, and interpretations. The person was simply one of those conditions that helped the feeling appear. Tonight, as you listen, something subtle may begin to change inside you. The confusion surrounding certain memories may start to soften. The mind may begin to recognize the difference between a person and the emotional atmosphere that surrounded them. And as that understanding slowly grows, something surprising begins to happen. The grip of attachment loosens. The restless replaying of the past begins to quiet down. The heart stops searching for something it believed another person had taken away. Because the moment you see clearly that you don't miss them, you miss the feeling, a new kind of freedom begins to appear. The past loses some of its emotional weight. The longing becomes easier to observe. The mind starts to understand one of the deepest insights in Buddhist wisdom. Feelings move through life the way weather moves through the sky. They appear, they change, and eventually they pass. Tonight we explore this powerful realization, the Buddhist insight that what we believe we lost was never truly the person, but the feeling we associated with them. And once the mind sees this clearly, attachment begins to loosen its hold. A quiet clarity replaces confusion. A calm understanding replaces longing. And slowly, you begin to see the past in a completely different way. You don't miss them. You miss the feeling. Let's begin. Something begins to change the moment a quiet realization appears in the mind. The moment the heart begins to question whether the person you miss is truly the person at all. Because when the mind slows down and starts looking more carefully at its own memories, a strange detail begins to reveal itself. The memories are rarely about the person alone. They are about how life felt when that person was present. The warmth of certain evenings, the calm during certain conversations, the sense that the world made a little more sense when they were near. And once this observation becomes clear, another question naturally follows. If what remains inside the mind is mostly a feeling, then what exactly are we holding on to when we say we miss someone? What often surprises people is that the mind does not store people the way it stores objects. A chair in a room can be remembered with clear details. The shape, the color, the location. But people are not remembered in the same way. The mind rarely keeps an exact recording of who someone was. Instead, it stores emotional impressions. These impressions become the real memory. Over time, they become stronger than the actual person who created them. Intertwined. When someone leaves your life, the brain does not simply remember their face or the words they used to say. What it remembers most clearly is the internal state that surrounded them, the sense of comfort, the relief from loneliness, the excitement that certain moments created, the feeling that the world felt softer or more alive when they were nearby. Slowly, the mind begins to merge the person and the feeling into one single idea. The brain quietly says to itself that this person is the feeling. This is where attachment begins to form. The human mind has a natural tendency to associate internal states with external causes. If a certain place made you feel peaceful, the mind believes the peace belonged to the place. If a certain song made you feel emotional, the mind believes the emotion lives inside the music. And if a certain person appeared in your life during moments of warmth, excitement, or relief, the mind begins to believe that those feelings came directly from them. But in reality, the person was only one part of a much larger set of conditions. The emotional atmosphere that forms around someone is created by many things working together at the same time. Your expectations, your mood at the time, the environment you were both in, the stage of life you were experiencing. Even the small uncertainties and hopes that existed in your mind during that period. All of these invisible conditions blend together to create what feels like a unique emotional world. And once that emotional world forms, the mind begins to attach the entire atmosphere to the person who happened to be present within it. Think about how memory works when you look back on certain relationships. Very rarely do people say they miss ordinary details like the exact conversations or the small disagreements that also existed. Instead, they talk about a feeling. They say things like, "Life felt lighter back then. Things felt simpler. There was a sense of warmth that seems impossible to recreate now." These statements reveal something very important about the way attachment works. What is being remembered is not the person alone. What is being remembered is the emotional environment that surrounded them. The mind creates a kind of emotional climate around certain people. Some individuals appear in your life during moments when you are discovering new things about yourself. Others appear during periods when you feel lonely, and their presence brings relief. Some relationships form when you are young and everything in the world still feels new and full of possibility. When these moments occur, the brain quietly records the emotional climate that existed at that time. Later, when the person is gone, the mind searches for the source of that climate. Because it cannot easily recreate the exact internal conditions that existed back then, it assumes the feeling must have belonged to the person. This is how the confusion between people and emotional atmospheres begins. Buddhist psychology recognized this pattern thousands of years ago. Teachers observed that the mind constantly misidentifies the source of its own experiences. Instead of seeing feelings as events happening inside consciousness, the mind attributes them to objects, people, and situations outside itself. In reality, what we experience around someone is not created by them alone. It is created by the interaction between two minds and the countless mental conditions both individuals bring into the moment. Consider how the same person can create completely different emotional atmospheres depending on the situation. One day, a conversation with them may feel comforting and calm. Another day, the same person may feel distant or confusing. If the feeling truly belonged to them as a permanent quality, it would remain stable, but it does not. The emotional environment shifts constantly. Chat point to class. This instability reveals something important. The feeling was never truly owned by the person. The emotional state arose from a moment that can never be perfectly repeated. However, when the mind looks back at the past, it does not remember every small change in that atmosphere. Instead, it compresses thousands of moments into one simplified emotional summary. That summary becomes the memory of the relationship. Over time, the mind begins to treat this summary as the true reality of what happened. This is why people sometimes say they miss someone even when they know the relationship itself was not always healthy or stable. When the brain reviews the past, it focuses on the emotional peaks rather than the entire story. The atmosphere that existed during the best moments becomes the dominant memory. The mind then begins searching for a way to return to that atmosphere. But there is a problem. The emotional environment that existed during a relationship cannot be recreated simply by bringing the person back into your life. Because the atmosphere was not produced by them alone. It was created by a unique intersection of time, circumstances, and inner psychological states that have already passed. In many cases, the feeling people long for is not even tied directly to the relationship itself. It is connected to who they were during that period of life, their age, their sense of possibility, the stage of personal growth they were experiencing, the uncertainty or excitement that existed at that time. When the mind misses the emotional climate of that period, it attaches the longing to the person who was present during it. This creates the illusion that the person is the missing piece. But what the mind truly misses is the internal state that existed during those moments. Understanding this difference begins to loosen the grip of attachment. When the mind realizes that feelings do not belong to people, something important begins to shift. Instead of searching for emotional relief in the return of someone from the past, the mind starts to observe the conditions that created those feelings in the first place. This observation opens the door to a deeper understanding of how emotional experiences arise. The warmth you felt around someone did not come from them alone. It came from the openness of your own mind during those moments, the curiosity you had about the world, the attention you gave to each experience, the sense of discovery that existed in that period of life. All of these internal conditions combined with the presence of another person to produce the atmosphere you now remember. Once those conditions change, the atmosphere naturally changes as well. This is not something to feel sad about. It is simply the nature of human experience. Every emotional environment is temporary. Every feeling arises from a network of conditions that constantly evolve. Relationships themselves are part of that changing landscape, not the permanent source of the emotions we associate with them. Seeing this clearly allows the mind to separate two things that were previously fused together. The person becomes one element in the memory. The feeling becomes another. When these two elements are no longer confused with each other, attachment begins to soften. You may still appreciate the role someone played in your life. You may still remember moments that were meaningful, but the desperate sense that something essential was taken away begins to dissolve, because the feeling itself was never owned by the other person. It was an experience that arose within your own mind when the right conditions appeared. And if those conditions could arise once, they can arise again in new forms, with new people, in new moments of life. This insight does not erase the past. Instead, it places it in a clearer perspective. 0.21. The emotional atmosphere that once surrounded someone becomes what it truly was. A temporary climate created by countless subtle factors. A moment in time when the mind was open in a particular way and life felt different than it does now. The person may have been part of that atmosphere, but they were never the entire source of it. Understanding this difference is one of the first steps toward freeing the mind from the illusion that happiness lives inside other people. Because when the mind stops confusing individuals with the emotional worlds that formed around them, it begins to see relationships with greater clarity. People enter our lives and participate in certain emotional climates. They share moments, conversations, laughter, and silence. But the feelings themselves arise inside the space of awareness where all experiences appear. Once this becomes visible, something quietly changes in the heart. Instead of chasing the past, the mind begins to observe the present. Instead of longing for a person as the source of a feeling, the mind begins to understand how feelings arise and pass within itself. And from that understanding, a deeper freedom slowly begins to grow. Once the mind begins to see the difference between a person and the emotional atmosphere that formed around them, something subtle starts to loosen. The grip of memory softens. The heart slowly realizes that what it has been holding onto was never entirely inside another human being. A quiet space opens in the mind where a deeper question begins to appear. If the feeling did not truly belong to the person, then where did it come from? This question is where one of the most important insights in Buddhist understanding begins to unfold. Because the moment you start asking where emotions actually arise, the entire way you understand attachment begins to change. There is a strange habit the human mind carries everywhere it goes. Whenever a powerful emotion appears, the mind immediately searches for something outside itself to blame or credit. If happiness appears, the mind points to the person standing nearby. If sadness appears, the mind looks at the situation and declares it the cause. This reaction feels natural because the brain is designed to simplify the complex experiences of life. Instead of examining the many subtle processes happening inside consciousness, it assigns emotions to visible objects and people. This is why someone may say a person makes them happy, or that someone else makes them anxious. The language itself reflects a deeper misunderstanding. The statement suggests that emotions are produced by people in the same way a lamp produces light. But the Buddhist observation of the mind reveals something very different. Feelings do not originate in people, they arise from conditions. A condition is anything that contributes to an experience appearing in the mind. It can be a memory, a belief, a physical sensation, a thought, or even a subtle expectation you are not consciously aware of. All of these factors interact with each other constantly. When they combine in a certain way, an emotion appears. When those conditions change, the emotion disappears. This means that what you feel in the presence of someone is not a direct product of that individual alone. It is the result of countless internal and external conditions meeting in a particular moment. The person may be part of the situation, but they are only one element within a much larger system. Consider how your emotional state can change around the same person depending on your mood that day. There are moments when someone's presence feels comforting and peaceful. At other times, the same person might feel irritating or distant. The individual has not fundamentally changed within those short periods of time. What changed were the internal conditions within your own mind, your level of energy, your expectations, the thoughts you carried into the interaction, the environment surrounding the conversation. Each of these conditions shapes how the mind interprets the moment. From that interpretation, a feeling emerges. The Buddha described this process with remarkable clarity. He explained that feelings arise when the mind comes into contact with something and interprets that contact. The interpretation is not passive. The mind immediately evaluates what it experiences. It silently asks whether something is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. This evaluation happens so quickly that most people never notice it. The brain labels experiences automatically. If something feels pleasant, the mind begins to move toward it. If something feels unpleasant, the mind moves away from it. These reactions create the foundation of attachment and aversion. In relationships, this process becomes especially powerful because human connection often produces strong emotional responses. When a conversation brings relief from loneliness, the mind records the pleasant feeling and associates it with the person involved. The brain quietly concludes that this individual is the source of the happiness. But what actually happened was more complex. The pleasant feeling arose because several conditions aligned. Perhaps the person listened attentively. Perhaps you were already feeling vulnerable and needed reassurance. Perhaps the moment occurred during a time when you were searching for meaning or companionship. Each of these internal conditions prepared the mind to experience relief and warmth. The other person simply participated in the moment where those conditions were activated. If those same conditions had existed while speaking with someone else, the feeling might have appeared there as well. But because the experience occurred with a specific person, the mind creates a shortcut in its understanding. It concludes that the individual themselves produce the emotion. This shortcut becomes the beginning of emotional attachment. Once the mind believes that happiness comes from a particular person, it begins to protect that connection. The thought of losing them creates anxiety because the brain assumes the feeling will disappear along with them. In reality, what the mind fears losing is the set of conditions that allowed the emotion to arise. However, those conditions are not fixed in time. They shift constantly. Your beliefs evolve. Your understanding of yourself changes. Your expectations about relationships grow or dissolve. Each time these internal elements change, the emotional experiences connected to them also change. This is why the same relationship can feel different at different stages of life. In the beginning, there may be excitement and curiosity. Later, there may be comfort and familiarity. At another point, there may be tension or distance. The person may remain the same, but the conditions shaping your emotional response continue to evolve. Recognizing this movement helps reveal a deeper truth about emotions. Feelings are not stable entities that belong to individuals. They are temporary events created by conditions that constantly interact. Buddhist teachers often compared emotions to natural phenomena such as weather. A clear sky does not belong to the mountain it appears above. A storm does not belong to the ocean it passes over. These events arise when certain atmospheric conditions gather together. When those conditions change, the sky becomes different again. The same principle applies to emotional experience. When someone enters your life during a period of openness, curiosity, or longing, the conditions may produce feelings of warmth and connection. If the same person appeared during a time of stress or exhaustion, the emotional result might be entirely different. This does not mean that relationships are meaningless. It means they are part of a much larger process occurring within consciousness. People participate in the conditions that shape emotions, but they are not the sole creators of those emotions. Understanding this distinction can feel uncomfortable at first because it challenges one of the most deeply held assumptions about love and happiness. Many people believe that the right person will permanently generate certain feelings within them. But Buddhist insight suggests something more realistic and ultimately more liberating. No person can permanently produce a feeling inside another mind. What they can do is participate in moments where certain conditions allow emotions to arise. When the mind begins to see emotions this way, attachment begins to loosen. Instead of believing that happiness depends on holding on to a specific individual, the mind recognizes that emotional well-being depends on understanding the conditions that shape experience. This realization shifts the focus inward. Rather than asking who can provide a particular feeling, the mind begins to ask what internal states allow that feeling to appear. It becomes clear that qualities such as openness, attention, and emotional awareness play a major role in shaping the emotional world we experience. For example, when the mind is calm and receptive, even simple interactions can feel meaningful. A short conversation with a stranger can bring a sense of connection. A quiet moment shared with someone can feel peaceful. These experiences do not require a specific person to exist. They arise when the mind is present and available to the moment. In contrast, when the mind is restless or distracted, even meaningful relationships may feel empty. A conversation that could have brought warmth passes by unnoticed, because the conditions within the mind are not prepared to receive it. This demonstrates that emotional experience depends heavily on the internal environment of awareness. The more clearly the mind understands this process, the less it depends on external circumstances for emotional stability. Relationships remain valuable and meaningful, but they are no longer seen as the sole source of happiness. Instead, they become part of a dynamic exchange between internal and external conditions. This perspective also changes how the mind responds to the end of a relationship. When someone leaves, the brain may initially assume that the feelings associated with them have disappeared forever. But when the nature of emotions is understood more deeply, it becomes clear that those feelings were never owned by the other person. They were experiences arising from conditions that can appear again in different forms. Warmth can arise again when the mind is open to connection. Peace can appear again when the mind becomes still. Excitement can return when curiosity and exploration enter life again. The emotional world is not limited to the presence of one individual. It is shaped by the evolving conditions of consciousness itself. This insight brings a quiet sense of freedom. Instead of clinging to the past in an attempt to preserve certain feelings, the mind begins to observe how emotions naturally rise and fall. There is less pressure to hold on to experiences that cannot remain unchanged. Relationships become appreciated for what they are, rather than treated as permanent sources of emotional security. The mind begins to see people not as containers of happiness, but as participants in moments where certain feelings happen to arise. This shift does not reduce the value of connection. In many ways, it deepens it. When someone is no longer viewed as the sole source of emotional fulfillment, there is less fear surrounding the relationship. The connection becomes more honest and less burdened by expectations. The presence of another person can be enjoyed without believing they must maintain a specific emotional state forever. This understanding also changes the way the mind experiences loss. Grief may still appear because separation naturally affects the emotional landscape of life. But beneath the sadness, there is also clarity. The mind recognizes that what once felt meaningful did not vanish entirely. The emotional capacities that allowed those experiences to occur still exist within awareness. They simply require new conditions to arise again. With time, the heart begins to see that emotional life is not something given by others. It is something constantly unfolding within the mind as different conditions meet. People come and go. Circumstances shift. Thoughts and beliefs evolve. Through all of this movement, emotions continue to appear and dissolve like waves on the surface of awareness. Seeing this process clearly is one of the central insights of Buddhist teaching. Feelings are conditions. They arise from interpretation, perception, and internal states. They are not possessions that belong to another human being. And when this truth becomes deeply understood, attachment slowly transforms into understanding. The mind stops searching for happiness inside another person and begins to observe the living process that creates emotions within itself. From that observation, a quieter and more stable form of freedom begins to grow. As the mind begins to understand that feelings arise from conditions rather than from people themselves, another hidden pattern slowly comes into view. Something deeper has been happening in the background of memory all along. Even when the mind realizes that emotions do not truly belong to another person, it still clings to certain moments as if they were shared possessions. A particular place suddenly feels connected to someone. A song carries the weight of a relationship. A simple memory becomes tied to a person so strongly that separating the two feels almost impossible. This reveals another quiet habit of the human mind, the tendency to give emotional ownership to experiences that were never owned by anyone. A certain silence can fall over the mind when a familiar place suddenly reminds you of someone. A street you once walked together. A cafe where conversations lasted longer than expected. a song that once played in the background while life felt calm and meaningful. In these moments, it may feel as though the memory itself belongs to that person. The mind quietly says that this moment was theirs, that this place was theirs, that the emotional meaning attached to the experience somehow lives inside them. But something important is happening behind the scenes of memory. The mind is creating ownership over experiences that were never owned by anyone. Human consciousness has a natural tendency to organize life by assigning emotional labels to moments. This helps the brain simplify the enormous number of experiences that occur every day. Instead of storing each moment separately, the mind groups them together under emotional categories. When a particular person is present during meaningful experiences, the mind links those emotions directly to them. Over time, this process becomes so automatic that the mind stops recognizing it as an interpretation. The emotional memory begins to feel like an objective truth. A simple walk in the evening becomes remembered as something that belonged to a relationship. A laugh shared during a conversation becomes part of the emotional identity of the other person. Even the mood that existed in that moment becomes attached to them. The mind begins to treat these experiences as shared property. But the truth is more subtle. No one actually owns a moment. Each experience that occurs in life is created by countless conditions interacting at the same time. The physical environment, the emotional state of both individuals, the thoughts present in the mind, the time of day, the stage of life, the expectations carried into the moment. All of these elements contribute to what the experience becomes. When a person happens to be present during such a moment, the mind naturally links the emotional atmosphere to them. But the experience itself was never truly contained within that person. This misunderstanding becomes especially powerful when relationships end, because when the mind has labeled certain memories as belonging to someone, separation feels like losing those moments entirely. A place that once felt warm may suddenly feel empty. A familiar routine may carry a quiet sense of absence. Even the emotional tone of certain memories can begin to feel painful. The mind interprets the loss of the person as the loss of the experiences themselves. But those experiences were never owned by the individual who shared them. They were events that arose within awareness under very specific conditions. The feeling of ownership that the mind creates is a psychological shortcut designed to make life easier to understand. The brain prefers simple explanations. It is easier to believe that someone created a feeling than to examine the complex network of factors that produce the experience. However, this shortcut has consequences. When emotional ownership is assigned to another person, attachment becomes stronger. The mind begins to believe that certain moments of happiness exist only through that individual. When the relationship changes or ends, the mind experiences the shift as a form of emotional theft. It feels as though something that once belonged to you has been taken away. In reality, what has changed are the conditions that once allowed those experiences to arise. The cafe still exists. The street is still there. The music can still be played. But the emotional climate that surrounded those moments was shaped by countless subtle elements that cannot be repeated in exactly the same way. This is one reason memory can feel so powerful. The mind is not simply remembering a person. It is remembering an entire emotional environment that existed at a particular point in time. Because the brain cannot easily recreate the full complexity of that environment, it attaches the memory to the person who shared it. The individual becomes a symbol representing the entire emotional atmosphere of that period. This is why certain relationships can feel larger than life when remembered in the mind. The person begins to carry the weight of many different experiences. They represent a time when life felt different, when certain hopes existed, when certain possibilities seemed open, when certain emotional states were more available than they are now. When the mind misses someone, it often misses the version of life that existed while they were present. But that version of life was never truly owned by the other person. It was the result of many conditions unfolding at once. Understanding this reveals another subtle layer of attachment. The mind not only assigns feelings to people, it assigns ownership of moments themselves. Shared experiences become emotionally branded with the identity of another person. This is why it can feel difficult to revisit certain places after a relationship ends. The mind believes those spaces belong to someone else. In reality, those places never belonged to anyone. They were simply environments where certain emotional conditions happened to arise. Over time, the brain builds entire emotional maps based on these associations. A city becomes connected to a relationship. A certain season of the year carries emotional significance. Even everyday routines become tied to the memory of another person. The mind quietly builds a landscape of experiences that appear to belong to the past. But the deeper truth is that these experiences were never owned by anyone. They were temporary events unfolding in awareness. The emotional meaning attached to them was created within the mind itself. Buddhist insight often encourages people to look carefully at how the mind assigns ownership to experiences, not just to objects or possessions, but to feelings, memories, and moments of life. The mind constantly says, "This is mine. This memory is mine. This happiness belonged to that person. This place belongs to the past." These quiet claims create the structure of attachment. When the mind believes something belongs to someone or to a particular moment in time, it begins to protect that belief. It resists any change that threatens the emotional structure built around the memory. But life is constantly changing. Moments pass. People move in different directions. Emotional climates evolve. The mind experiences this natural movement as loss because it believes the experiences were owned by someone who is now gone. Seeing this process clearly allows the illusion of emotional ownership to soften. A memory can still be meaningful without belonging to someone. A place can still hold beauty without being tied to the past. A moment can still be remembered with warmth without needing to recreate the exact conditions that produced it. When the mind releases the idea that experiences belong to specific individuals, the emotional landscape becomes lighter. Memories become part of life rather than objects that must be protected. Shared experiences become what they truly were, brief intersections of two lives within a much larger flow of time. This understanding does not erase the emotional value of those moments. Instead, it allows them to exist without turning them into sources of attachment. The walk down that street can still be remembered. The conversation in that cafe can still be appreciated. The song can still be played and enjoyed. But the mind no longer treats those experiences as something that was taken away. They were never owned in the first place. They were simply moments that arose and passed, like all experiences do. When this becomes clear, the heart begins to experience memories differently. Instead of feeling that something has been lost, the mind begins to see that the experiences were always temporary events unfolding within life. They were never possessions. They were never property. They were simply moments where certain emotional conditions met for a short time. Understanding this gradually transforms the way attachment operates. The mind no longer builds emotional territories around people and memories. It begins to see experiences as part of a continuous flow rather than as objects that belong to someone. From this perspective, separation does not erase the past. It simply reveals the truth that the past was never owned by anyone. It was a series of moments shared briefly before continuing on their natural path. When the mind stops labeling those moments as belonging to a person, something quietly changes. The feeling of loss begins to soften. Memories remain, but they no longer carry the weight of ownership. They become part of life's unfolding story rather than something that must be held onto. And as this understanding deepens, the mind slowly learns to experience the present moment without assigning it to the past or to another person. Experiences begin to unfold freely again. Moments arise without needing to belong to anyone. And within that freedom, attachment gradually begins to dissolve. As the mind begins to release the belief that moments and memories belong to a person, another deeper assumption slowly starts to reveal itself. Beneath the attachment to shared experiences lies an even stronger belief that most people rarely question. The belief that the feelings inside a relationship should remain the same, that the warmth of the beginning should stay forever, that the emotional atmosphere created between two people should continue without changing. When that expectation quietly lives in the mind, every shift in emotion begins to feel like something is going wrong. But the deeper truth is that relationships were never designed to hold permanent emotional states. A quiet disappointment often appears in people when they look back at relationships that once felt alive and vibrant. At the beginning, there was excitement, curiosity, and the feeling that every conversation carried a spark. Time felt lighter. Simple moments felt meaningful. The mind interpreted those feelings as proof that something stable had been found. Without realizing it, the brain began to expect that emotional atmosphere to continue indefinitely. This expectation forms naturally because the mind prefers stability. Human consciousness constantly searches for patterns that can be predicted and controlled. When something pleasant appears, the mind immediately tries to preserve it. The brain quietly makes a promise to itself that this feeling should stay. But emotions are not designed to stay the same. They are constantly changing responses to shifting conditions. In the early stages of a relationship, the mind is filled with novelty. Everything feels new. Each discovery about the other person activates curiosity. Conversations carry a sense of exploration. Even ordinary activities feel exciting because they are shared with someone whose presence has not yet become familiar. Novelty itself produces powerful emotional energy. The brain releases chemicals that heighten attention and amplify feelings of connection. The mind interprets this heightened emotional state as evidence that something special has appeared. However, novelty cannot last forever. As time passes, familiarity replaces discovery. The mind begins to understand the other person more clearly. The unknown aspects that once created excitement slowly fade. The emotional intensity naturally adjusts as the brain adapts to the presence of the relationship. This shift is often misunderstood. Because the mind remembers the emotional intensity of the beginning, it expects that same intensity to continue. When the feeling changes, the brain interprets the shift as a problem. People may begin to wonder whether something is wrong with the relationship. They may believe the connection has weakened. In reality, what has changed is simply the emotional condition created by novelty. Buddhist teachings often emphasize a principle known as impermanence. Impermanence means that all experiences constantly change. Nothing remains fixed. Every emotional state, every thought, every moment of life moves through a cycle of appearing and disappearing. This principle applies to relationships just as much as it applies to everything else. The warmth that existed in the beginning was a temporary condition created by curiosity and discovery. The calm that appears later is another condition created by familiarity and understanding. Even moments of tension or distance are simply emotional states shaped by changing circumstances. Yet the mind continues to hold on to the expectation that the original feeling should remain. This expectation creates a quiet tension beneath many relationships. Instead of observing emotions as changing experiences, the mind tries to preserve a specific emotional atmosphere. When that atmosphere fades, disappointment arises. The disappointment is not created by the relationship itself. It is created by the expectation of permanence. This expectation becomes stronger because memory does not record emotions in a balanced way. The brain tends to highlight emotionally intense moments while ignoring the gradual transitions between them. When people remember the beginning of a relationship, they often recall the strongest emotional peaks. They remember the excitement of early conversations, the sense of connection, the feeling that something meaningful had appeared in life. What the mind rarely remembers are the countless ordinary moments that followed. The days when emotions were calm and uneventful, the times when the relationship simply existed without dramatic feelings attached to it. Because memory highlights the peaks, the mind begins to believe that those peaks represent the true state of the relationship. Anything less begins to feel like a decline. In reality, emotional intensity was never meant to remain constant. The emotional system of the human brain constantly adjusts to new conditions. This process is known as emotional adaptation. When something new enters life, it creates a strong emotional response. Over time, the mind becomes accustomed to the experience and the intensity naturally decreases. This adjustment allows the brain to remain balanced. If emotional intensity remained at its highest level permanently, the mind would become overwhelmed. The nervous system is designed to move between different emotional states rather than staying fixed in one. Understanding this movement reveals why relationships often feel different as time passes. What once felt thrilling may later feel calm. What once felt uncertain may become stable. The emotional atmosphere changes because the conditions shaping it continue to evolve. However, the mind often interprets these natural changes as evidence that something has been lost. This interpretation can lead people to search for the original emotional intensity again. They may try to recreate the feelings of the beginning by revisiting old memories, repeating certain activities, or expecting the other person to behave in the same way they once did. But emotional conditions cannot be recreated simply by repeating external actions. The original atmosphere emerged from a unique combination of circumstances that existed only at that time. Both individuals were in different stages of life. Their expectations were different. Their knowledge of each other was incomplete. Their curiosity was fresh. All of these elements produced the emotional environment that memory now remembers. As those conditions changed, the emotional environment changed as well. This is not a failure of the relationship, it is the natural movement of life. Buddhist philosophy encourages people to observe emotional experiences without expecting them to remain the same. Instead of clinging to a particular feeling, the mind learns to recognize the changing nature of emotions. This observation brings a deeper sense of calm. When emotional states are allowed to move naturally, relationships become less burdened by unrealistic expectations. People no longer demand that the same emotional atmosphere remain forever. Instead, they begin to appreciate the different stages that a connection passes through. Early excitement gives way to deeper understanding. Curiosity evolves into familiarity. Emotional intensity transforms into stability. Each stage has its own value, but the mind must release the belief that the earliest stage represents the permanent standard. Another reason people expect emotional permanence is that the mind associates stability with safety. When a feeling of warmth appears, the brain treats it as a form of emotional security. The idea that this feeling might change creates anxiety. To protect itself, the mind begins to believe that the relationship must preserve the feeling exactly as it was. This belief creates pressure on both individuals. The relationship becomes responsible for maintaining a specific emotional experience rather than allowing emotions to arise naturally. When people feel responsible for producing a certain feeling in another person, the connection can become strained. Instead of simply sharing life together, each person begins trying to maintain an emotional standard that cannot realistically remain unchanged. Buddhist teachings encourage a different approach. Rather than trying to control emotions, the mind learns to observe them. Emotions are seen as temporary movements within awareness rather than fixed states that must be protected. This perspective allows relationships to breathe. Instead of demanding that happiness remain constant, people begin to recognize that emotional life moves through many different phases. There will be moments of excitement, moments of calm, moments of uncertainty, moments of distance. Each of these states is part of the living process of connection. None of them represent a permanent identity of the relationship. When this understanding becomes clear, disappointment begins to soften. The mind no longer measures the present moment against the emotional peaks of the past. It sees each stage of the relationship as a natural expression of changing conditions. This shift also changes how people experience the end of relationships. When a relationship ends, the mind often compares the present emptiness to the emotional intensity that once existed. Because it believed that feeling should have remained forever, the mind interprets its disappearance as a loss. But if emotions are understood as temporary conditions, the situation appears differently. The feeling that once existed was always moving. It arose from specific circumstances and eventually passed as those circumstances changed. The relationship did not take the feeling away. The emotional conditions simply evolved. This realization does not remove sadness entirely. Loss can still be painful because relationships shape many parts of life. But the mind no longer believes that something permanent has been destroyed. Instead, it sees that emotional experiences were always temporary. They were never meant to stay fixed. This understanding creates space for acceptance. Rather than fighting the changing nature of emotions, the mind begins to move with them. Relationships are no longer expected to preserve a single emotional state forever. They become living processes shaped by time, growth, and shifting conditions. The warmth of the past can still be appreciated, the calm of the present can still be valued, and the uncertainty of change can be accepted as part of life's natural movement. When the illusion of emotional permanence dissolves, something remarkable happens. Relationships become lighter. They are no longer measured against an impossible standard. Instead of trying to hold on to a feeling that cannot remain unchanged, the mind begins to appreciate each stage of connection as it unfolds. And in that acceptance, a deeper kind of stability begins to appear. Not the stability of frozen emotions, but the stability of understanding. The understanding that every feeling is temporary, and that relationships, like all living things, exist within the gentle rhythm of change. As the mind slowly accepts that emotions inside relationships cannot remain permanently the same, another quiet shift begins to appear in how the past is remembered. When the expectation of emotional permanence fades, the mind often turns backward and begins examining memories with unusual intensity. But something subtle happens during this process. The past that the mind reviews is rarely the past that actually happened. Instead, memory begins to reshape the emotional story of the relationship. Moments that were once ordinary become brighter, warmer, and more meaningful than they originally felt. The mind begins to polish certain memories until they shine in a way they never did when they first occurred. There is a strange transformation that takes place after separation. While the relationship was unfolding in real time, many moments passed quietly without much attention. Some days felt ordinary, some conversations were brief, some experiences were simply part of everyday life. But once the relationship ends, those same moments begin to change in the mind. Memory does not behave like a camera recording events exactly as they occurred. Instead, it behaves more like a storyteller rewriting a narrative over time. The mind quietly edits the emotional tone of past experiences. Certain scenes become brighter, while others fade into the background. This process is not intentional. The brain is designed to organize experiences in a way that helps create meaning. When something important happens in life, the mind begins to reconstruct the past in order to understand it. Separation is one of those moments that triggers reconstruction. When a person leaves or a relationship ends, the brain attempts to make sense of the emotional change. It looks backward and begins gathering memories that appear to explain why the relationship mattered. But in doing so, the mind rarely retrieves the past in a balanced way. Instead, it highlights the moments that carry emotional weight. A simple laugh becomes a symbol of happiness. A quiet evening together becomes evidence of deep connection. Even small gestures that once felt ordinary may begin to carry powerful meaning. This selective focus slowly reshapes the emotional story of the relationship. The mind begins to believe that the past was filled with more emotional intensity than it actually contained. One reason this happens is that memory is strongly influenced by present emotions. When the mind feels loss, it searches for reasons to explain that feeling. It begins to scan the past, looking for moments that justify the current sense of longing. The brain asks itself why this person matters so much. To answer that question, memory gathers scenes that appear meaningful. Moments of warmth are recalled more vividly than moments of frustration. Pleasant conversations become clearer than disagreements that also existed. The emotional story becomes simplified. What remains in memory is not the full relationship, but the emotional highlights. Over time, these highlights form a narrative that feels powerful and convincing. The mind begins to believe that the relationship was defined by those emotional peaks. But relationships are rarely composed only of emotional peaks. They contain long periods of ordinary experience, daily routines, neutral conversations, moments of distraction or silence. These ordinary parts of life rarely remain in memory with the same clarity. Because they do not carry strong emotional intensity, the brain gradually allows them to fade. What remains is a condensed version of the relationship where meaningful moments appear closer together than they actually were. This process makes the past feel richer than it truly was. Psychologists often describe this pattern as emotional editing. The mind becomes a quiet editor that rearranges scenes in order to create a more dramatic narrative. This editing process helps explain why memories of relationships often feel different months or years after they end. During the relationship itself, the mind experienced a wide range of emotions. There were moments of closeness, but also moments of misunderstanding. There were times of excitement, but also periods when the connection felt routine. When memory later reconstructs the story, many of those neutral or difficult moments disappear. The emotional tone becomes smoother and more romanticized. This romanticizing effect strengthens attachment. Because the mind remembers the past as more emotionally perfect than it actually was, the present begins to feel empty by comparison. The brain believes that something extraordinary has been lost. But what has actually been lost is the edited version of the past created by memory. The real relationship contained far more complexity. Another factor that shapes emotional memory is contrast. When a relationship ends, the emotional environment of life changes suddenly. The mind experiences the contrast between past and present very strongly. This contrast amplifies the emotional significance of past moments. For example, a simple evening conversation that once felt pleasant may later appear deeply meaningful when compared to the silence that follows separation. The difference between past connection and present absence creates emotional intensity in memory. The brain interprets this contrast as proof that the relationship contained extraordinary value. But the emotional power of the memory comes largely from comparison. Without the contrast of absence, the moment may have remained just another ordinary evening. Memory also tends to compress time. Events that happened months apart may appear in the mind as if they occurred close together. This compression creates the impression that meaningful moments happened constantly. The mind forgets the spaces between them. When someone looks back on a relationship, they may recall several powerful memories in quick succession. A meaningful conversation, a moment of laughter, a gesture of kindness. Because these memories appear one after another in the mind, the brain assumes that the emotional intensity was continuous. In reality, those moments were scattered across weeks or months of ordinary life. Memory quietly removes the empty spaces between them. This process makes the emotional story feel richer than the lived experience. The brain is not lying when it reconstructs the past this way. It is trying to build a coherent narrative that explains why the relationship mattered. But the narrative it builds is often shaped more by emotional needs than by factual accuracy. Another element that changes memory after separation is the human desire for meaning. People naturally want to believe that significant experiences in their lives served an important purpose. When a relationship ends, the mind begins searching for meaning in the memories that remain. It tries to identify moments that appear symbolic. A particular conversation may begin to represent the entire connection. A certain day may feel like a turning point, even if it seemed ordinary at the time. These symbolic interpretations add emotional depth to the past, but they also exaggerate the significance of certain experiences. The mind begins to weave the memories into a story about what the relationship represented. This story can become more powerful than the relationship itself. Once the story is formed, memory continues to reinforce it. Each time the mind revisits the past, it strengthens the emotional narrative that has already been created. The memories become more vivid, not because they are more accurate, but because they are being repeated. Repetition strengthens emotional impressions. The more often the mind revisits a memory, the more emotionally real it feels. This repetition can make the past feel almost sacred. Moments that once felt ordinary become treasured scenes that the mind returns to again and again. But this repeated revisiting also removes the memory further from its original context. Each time the memory is recalled, the brain subtly alters it. Small emotional details may be added. Certain elements may be emphasized more strongly. Over time, the memory becomes a reconstruction rather than a direct reflection of the past. Understanding this process helps reveal why attachment can feel so powerful after separation. The mind is not simply remembering what happened. It is remembering a refined, emotional version of the past that has been shaped by longing, contrast, and repetition. The past becomes a place where emotions appear more intense and more meaningful than they were during the original experience. Recognizing this pattern allows the mind to see memories with greater clarity. The emotional beauty of certain moments can still be appreciated, but the mind no longer assumes that those moments represented the entire relationship. They become part of a larger story that included many different emotional tones, some warm, some neutral, some difficult. Seeing the full complexity of the past helps restore balance to the present. Instead of comparing current life to a polished version of memory, the mind begins to see both past and present as evolving experiences. Memories remain meaningful, but they no longer carry exaggerated emotional weight. They become part of the natural flow of life, rather than symbols of something that was perfect and cannot return. This shift creates a sense of emotional relief. The mind stops chasing an idealized version of the past. It begins to recognize that what it misses most strongly is often the story it created about the relationship, not the full reality of what was lived. Not the full reality of what was lived. When memory is understood as a storyteller rather than a perfect recorder, attachment begins to soften. The past can be remembered without needing to be glorified. Moments can be appreciated without turning them into evidence of something that should have lasted forever. And slowly the mind begins to release the emotional exaggeration that memory created. What remains is a quieter understanding. The past contained meaningful experiences, but it was never as perfect as memory now suggests. And the present still holds the possibility for new moments that memory has not yet had the chance to reshape. As the mind begins to see how memory quietly reshapes the past, Another pattern slowly becomes visible beneath the surface of relationships. The mind does not only rewrite what has already happened, it also begins repeating what it remembers. Emotional history quietly turns into emotional habit. The feelings that once existed in a relationship leave a subtle imprint inside the mind, and without noticing it, the brain begins searching for people who can recreate that same emotional atmosphere again. What appears on the surface as attraction or connection is often something deeper. The mind is not always looking for a new person. Many times it is looking for a familiar feeling. There is a quiet comfort in familiarity that the mind rarely questions. When a certain emotional environment becomes known, the brain begins to treat it as safe territory. Even if the experience contained confusion or difficulty, the familiarity of the emotional pattern can still feel strangely comforting. The mind prefers what it already understands. It knows how to navigate familiar emotional climates, even when those climates were not entirely healthy. This hidden preference shapes the way people choose relationships far more than they realize. When someone enters a new connection, the mind immediately begins comparing the emotional atmosphere to previous experiences. The brain searches for signals that feel recognizable. A certain tone of voice, a particular type of attention, or even a similar rhythm of communication can trigger the feeling that something meaningful is happening. But often the attraction is not directed toward the person themselves. It is directed toward the emotional environment that person seems to recreate. This is why people sometimes find themselves drawn to individuals who resemble previous partners in subtle ways. The resemblance may not be physical. It may exist in the emotional dynamics of the interaction. Perhaps the person expresses care in a familiar way. Perhaps the emotional rhythm of the relationship echoes something the mind has experienced before. When the brain detects these similarities, it sends a signal of recognition. Recognition creates comfort. Comfort is often mistaken for connection. But recognition does not always mean that two people truly understand each other. It simply means that the emotional conditions feel familiar. The mind is extremely sensitive to these emotional echoes. When a certain emotional environment once played a significant role in life, the brain stores it as a pattern. Later, when a similar pattern appears, the mind reacts quickly. It assumes that the same emotional experience will return. This reaction can make new relationships feel intense very quickly. The sense of familiarity creates the impression that the connection is special or meaningful. The brain interprets the emotional recognition as evidence that the person has a unique place in your life. In reality, what the mind has recognized is not the person. It has recognized the pattern. Emotional patterns operate like internal templates that shape how the mind interprets relationships. These templates are created through past experiences. Each time a relationship produces strong emotions, the brain records the emotional environment surrounding those moments. Later, the mind quietly searches for situations that resemble those environments. This search happens automatically. Most people believe they are choosing relationships based on attraction or compatibility. But underneath that conscious choice, the mind is often guided by the desire to recreate familiar emotional states. These emotional states can be positive or negative. Someone who once experienced deep comfort in a relationship may search for people who recreate that sense of calm. Someone who experienced emotional uncertainty may unknowingly seek out relationships that produce the same tension. The brain does not always distinguish between healthy familiarity and unhealthy familiarity. It simply recognizes patterns. If a certain emotional environment once became deeply embedded in memory, the mind may attempt to return to it again and again. This pattern can create cycles in relationships that feel confusing. A person may notice that different partners seem to create similar emotional situations. The names change, the circumstances change, but the emotional dynamics remain surprisingly similar. This repetition is not random. It is the mind attempting to recreate an emotional environment that has become familiar. Buddhist psychology often describes this tendency as a form of unconscious craving. The mind craves emotional experiences that feel known. Even when those experiences were painful, the familiarity provides a sense of psychological stability. The brain feels safer navigating emotions it already understands than exploring completely new emotional territory. This is one reason people sometimes remain attached to certain emotional patterns long after a relationship has ended. The emotional environment itself becomes addictive. Not in the sense of pleasure alone, but in the sense of familiarity. The mind becomes accustomed to a particular rhythm of emotional experience. When that rhythm disappears, the brain begins searching for ways to recreate it. This search can appear as longing for a specific person. But often the deeper longing is for the emotional structure that surrounded the relationship, the sense of being needed, the sense of being understood, the tension of uncertainty, the warmth of reassurance. Each of these emotional elements forms part of the pattern. When the mind meets someone who activates similar elements, it quickly interprets the situation as meaningful. This is why attraction can feel immediate and powerful even when two people barely know each other. The mind is responding to emotional familiarity rather than genuine understanding. Recognizing this pattern can feel unsettling at first. Many people want to believe that relationships are guided purely by conscious choice and emotional authenticity. But the mind carries many hidden influences shaped by past experience. Understanding these influences does not diminish the value of relationships. Instead, it brings clarity to the process by which connections form. When the mind becomes aware of its tendency to recreate emotional environments, it gains the ability to pause and observe its own reactions. Instead of immediately interpreting familiarity as connection, the mind begins to ask deeper questions. Is this attraction coming from genuine understanding, or is the mind recognizing a familiar emotional pattern? This question opens space for greater awareness. The brain begins to see that emotional recognition and genuine connection are not the same thing. True connection grows through understanding, shared values, and mutual awareness. Familiar emotional patterns, on the other hand, often arise from the past. They belong to previous experiences that shaped the mind's expectations about relationships. When people unconsciously follow these patterns, they may find themselves repeating emotional stories without realizing it. Each new relationship begins to resemble the last one in subtle ways. The mind believes it is searching for happiness, but it may actually be searching for familiarity. Buddhist teachings encourage observing these patterns without judgment. The goal is not to blame the mind for its habits. The mind developed these patterns as a way to navigate life, but awareness allows the possibility of change. When emotional habits become visible, the mind can begin to step outside them. Instead of automatically moving toward familiar emotional environments, it learns to stay present and observe what is actually happening in the moment. This shift creates space for new kinds of connection to appear. Connections that are not driven by emotional repetition, but by genuine curiosity and understanding. Relationships formed from awareness often feel different. They may not produce the immediate intensity created by emotional familiarity. Instead, they develop gradually. Understanding deepens through conversation and shared experience rather than through instant emotional recognition. For some people, this slower process can feel unfamiliar. The mind may initially interpret the absence of strong emotional echoes as a lack of connection, but with time, the difference becomes clear. A relationship built on genuine presence does not depend on recreating the past. It grows through new experiences that unfold naturally. Breaking the habit of emotional repetition requires patience. The mind must learn to tolerate unfamiliar emotional environments. Instead of searching for the feelings it already knows, it begins to explore new ways of relating. This exploration can feel uncertain at first, but uncertainty is often the doorway to growth. When the mind stops chasing familiar emotional patterns, it becomes free to experience relationships in a fresh way. Each person becomes an individual rather than a reflection of the past. The emotional environment of the relationship emerges naturally instead of being recreated from memory. This transformation brings a quiet form of freedom. The mind no longer feels compelled to repeat emotional stories. It begins to recognize that genuine connection cannot be forced through familiarity. True connection arises when two people meet without the weight of old emotional patterns guiding their expectations. And as this awareness deepens, the mind gradually releases the habit of recreating emotional dependence. What once felt like attraction driven by destiny becomes visible as a familiar emotional echo. With that recognition, the cycle begins to dissolve. The mind learns that relationships do not need to repeat the past in order to feel meaningful. They can become entirely new experiences unfolding in the present. And within that newness, connection becomes something alive rather than something remembered. As the mind begins to recognize how it unconsciously repeats emotional environments from the past, a deeper layer of the process slowly becomes visible. Beneath the patterns of attraction, beneath the memories that shape expectations, there exists an even more immediate event happening inside the mind every moment. Before the mind creates stories about relationships, before it labels someone as important or meaningful, something much simpler occurs first. A feeling appears. It may be pleasant. It may be uncomfortable. Sometimes it may feel neutral and barely noticeable. Yet these small sensations quietly become the foundation from which attachment eventually grows. A subtle shift in the mind often begins with something so small that it is rarely noticed. A slight sense of warmth when someone smiles, a quiet comfort during a conversation, a brief feeling of tension when a certain tone of voice appears. These tiny emotional signals arrive before the mind has time to analyze what is happening. The Buddha described this moment with a word that appears often in Buddhist teachings, Vedana. Vedana refers to the immediate feeling tone that arises whenever the mind experiences something. It is not yet a complex emotion like love, jealousy, or sadness. It is much simpler than that. It is the first sensory reaction that appears when the mind meets the world. Every experience produces this reaction. When the mind hears a sound, sees a face, remembers a thought, or senses a physical touch, the brain immediately produces a feeling tone. This tone falls into three basic categories. The experience may feel pleasant, it may feel unpleasant, or it may feel neutral. These feeling tones arise extremely quickly, often before conscious thought has time to intervene. For example, when someone hears a friendly voice speaking their name, the mind may instantly generate a pleasant sensation. When someone hears criticism or harsh words, the mind may immediately produce discomfort. When the mind encounters something ordinary, like the sound of distant traffic or the sight of a passing stranger, the feeling tone may remain neutral. This process occurs continuously. Every moment, the mind is generating small signals that indicate whether an experience feels attractive, uncomfortable, or indifferent. At first, these signals seem insignificant, but they play a powerful role in shaping attachment. When a pleasant feeling tone appears, the mind instinctively moves toward it. It begins to want the experience to continue. It may not yet know why the feeling is pleasant, but it recognizes that the sensation is enjoyable. The brain begins to associate the pleasant sensation with whatever object or person happened to be present when the feeling arose. This is the earliest stage of attachment. Before the mind develops emotional stories about a person, it has already begun linking that individual to a pleasant feeling tone. The person may simply have spoken kindly, smiled gently, or listened with attention. The mind experiences the pleasant sensation and quietly records the association. Later, when the same person appears again, the mind remembers the pleasant sensation and anticipates that the feeling may return. This anticipation strengthens interest. The mind becomes more attentive to the person. Small gestures that might otherwise go unnoticed begin to feel meaningful because they are linked to the pleasant sensation stored in memory. Over time, the mind constructs a larger emotional narrative around these repeated experiences. But the narrative began with something very small. A simple, pleasant-feeling tone. In the same way, unpleasant-feeling tones can shape relationships in the opposite direction. When the mind experiences discomfort around someone, even if the cause is subtle, the brain records the association. Perhaps the person's tone sounded impatient. Perhaps their words triggered an old memory. Perhaps the emotional atmosphere simply felt tense. The unpleasant sensation may be brief, but the mind quietly remembers it. Later encounters with that person may carry a subtle sense of caution. The mind may not consciously remember the original moment, but the feeling tone remains stored in emotional memory. This is why certain people can evoke immediate comfort, while others create unexplained tension. The brain has already formed associations through the feeling tones of past experiences. Most people are not aware that this process is happening. They believe attachment begins when they consciously decide that someone is important or attractive. But by the time that conscious decision appears, the mind has already processed many layers of feeling tones. These sensations quietly guide attention and interest long before the mind forms deliberate judgments. Buddhist teachings place great importance on recognizing Vedana because it reveals the earliest stage of attachment. If the mind can observe feeling tones clearly, it can see how emotional reactions begin to develop. Without this awareness, the process unfolds automatically. A pleasant sensation leads to desire. An unpleasant sensation leads to resistance. A neutral sensation leads to indifference. These reactions become the foundation of emotional patterns. In relationships, pleasant feeling tones often create the first spark of attraction. When someone makes us feel understood, appreciated, or emotionally safe, the mind experiences pleasant sensations that it wants to repeat. The brain begins to seek out situations where those sensations can occur again. This desire gradually deepens into emotional attachment, but the attachment is not truly directed toward the person alone. It is directed toward the pleasant sensation that the person helped create. Understanding this distinction changes how the mind interprets attraction. The pleasant feeling tone is not owned by the other person. It arises from the interaction between your mind and the conditions present in that moment. The other person may contribute to those conditions, but the sensation itself is generated within your own experience. This insight helps explain why two people can experience the same interaction differently. One person may feel warmth and comfort during a conversation, while the other person feels uncertainty or tension. The external situation is the same, but the internal conditions of each mind shape the feeling tone differently. Each individual carries their own memories, expectations, and emotional sensitivities into the moment. These internal conditions influence whether the experience feels pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Because feeling tones arise so quickly, the mind rarely pauses to examine them. It simply reacts. Pleasant sensations lead to craving. Unpleasant sensations lead to avoidance. Neutral sensations lead to disinterest. These reactions happen again and again throughout daily life. In relationships, the repeated experience of pleasant feeling tones can gradually build the sense that someone is essential to emotional happiness. The mind begins to believe that the person is the source of the good feelings. But Buddhist insight reminds us that the person is not the true source. The sensation arises within the mind through the meeting of many conditions. The person's behavior, your emotional openness, The context of the moment and countless subtle influences all combine to create the experience. When those conditions change, the feeling tone changes as well. This is why relationships can feel different over time. The pleasant sensations that once appeared frequently may become less intense as circumstances evolve. The mind may interpret this change as a loss of connection, but the deeper reality is simply that the conditions generating the feeling tone have shifted. Recognizing the role of Vedana helps the mind understand the early stages of attachment before they become overwhelming. When a pleasant sensation appears, awareness can observe it without immediately turning it into craving. When an unpleasant sensation arises, awareness can notice the discomfort without creating aversion. This practice allows emotions to move naturally without becoming fixed attachments. Instead of being pulled automatically toward pleasant sensations, the mind begins to see them as temporary experiences. They arise, remain briefly, and pass away. The same is true for unpleasant sensations. They appear, create discomfort, and eventually dissolve when the conditions supporting them change. When the mind learns to observe these feeling tones carefully, it begins to understand that emotions are not permanent features of relationships. They are momentary signals created by the meeting of internal and external conditions. This understanding weakens the belief that happiness lives inside another person. The pleasant sensation that arises in someone's presence is simply one moment in the ongoing flow of experience. It does not define the entire relationship. It does not guarantee that the same feeling will appear again. It is simply a passing event within awareness. As the mind becomes more attentive to these subtle sensations, the process of attachment becomes easier to recognize. The moment a pleasant feeling appears, the mind can observe the urge to hold on to it. The moment discomfort appears, the mind can notice the impulse to push it away. This awareness interrupts the automatic chain that usually leads from sensation to attachment. Instead of being carried forward by craving or resistance, the mind begins to rest in observation. Feelings continue to arise and pass, but they no longer control the direction of attention. This shift creates a new kind of freedom in relationships. Connection can still exist. Warmth and appreciation can still be experienced, but the mind no longer depends on repeating specific sensations in order to feel secure. Relationships become opportunities for shared experience rather than sources of emotional possession. The presence of another person can be enjoyed without believing that the pleasant sensations they evoke must remain forever. This understanding does not reduce the beauty of connection, it deepens it. Because when the mind is free from attachment to specific feeling tones, it becomes more open to the richness of each moment. Pleasant sensations can be appreciated without being clung to. Unpleasant sensations can be observed without being feared. Neutral moments can be noticed without being ignored. Each experience becomes part of a continuous flow rather than a fixed emotional state that must be preserved. In this way, the teaching of Vedana reveals the earliest stage of attachment. By understanding how feeling tones arise, the mind begins to see the very first step that leads toward emotional dependence. And when that step becomes visible, the possibility of freedom appears. The mind learns that feelings arise before attachment forms. And with awareness, attachment does not need to follow, as the mind begins to see how pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral sensations quietly shape the early stages of attachment. Another layer of understanding starts to appear. If attachment begins with simple feeling tones, then something deeper must happen before the mind calls it love. Because what people often describe as love does not always begin with deep understanding or shared values. Sometimes it begins with a simple emotional shift, a moment when the presence of someone seems to calm the noise inside the mind. That quiet relief can feel powerful. It can feel meaningful, and slowly, without realizing it, the mind begins to interpret that relief as love. A certain calm can enter the mind when someone appears at the right moment in life. Perhaps the mind was feeling uncertain, restless, or emotionally tired. Perhaps there was loneliness that had quietly built over time. Then suddenly a person enters the environment, and their presence softens that tension. Conversations feel easy. Silence feels comfortable. The emotional pressure that once existed inside the mind begins to relax. That relief can feel extraordinary. When emotional weight disappears, even briefly, the mind experiences a powerful sense of gratitude. The brain interprets the change as something valuable. It begins to associate the person with the relief that has appeared. This is one of the earliest moments when emotional comfort begins to resemble love. But emotional relief and love are not the same experience. Relief occurs when a tension inside the mind dissolves. Love is something deeper that grows through understanding, respect, patience, and shared growth. Relief is immediate. Love develops slowly. The difficulty arises because relief can feel so powerful that the mind mistakes it for something more permanent. Consider what happens when someone has been carrying emotional stress for a long period of time. When another person enters their life and listens without judgment, the mind feels seen. The pressure inside begins to loosen. That moment of emotional release creates a strong, pleasant sensation. The mind quickly connects that sensation to the person who happened to be present. The brain concludes that this individual has a special ability to create happiness. But the deeper truth is that the relief came from the mind itself, releasing tension. The other person simply provided a safe environment where that release became possible. When emotional relief is confused with love, attachment grows quickly. The mind begins to depend on the person to recreate that calming effect. Their presence becomes associated with stability. Their absence may feel like the return of emotional pressure. Over time, the relationship may begin to revolve around this dynamic. One person becomes the emotional anchor, while the other experiences comfort through their presence. At first, this dynamic can feel very strong and meaningful, but emotional relief is often temporary. The internal tension that created the need for relief may return. Life circumstances may change. The emotional needs of both individuals may evolve. When that happens, the same person may no longer produce the same calming effect. The mind may feel confused by this change. It may begin to wonder whether the love has faded. But what has actually changed is the emotional condition that once produced the relief. When love is based primarily on emotional comfort, it can become fragile. The relationship becomes responsible for maintaining a specific internal state within the mind. This creates pressure on both individuals. The person providing comfort may feel responsible for preserving the emotional balance of the other. The person receiving the comfort may feel anxious about losing the source of their relief. The relationship becomes centered around maintaining emotional stability rather than exploring deeper connection. Buddhist understanding encourages observing this pattern carefully. Emotional relief is not a problem by itself. Feeling safe and calm around another person is a natural part of connection. But when relief becomes the main foundation of attachment, the relationship can become dependent on repeating the same emotional experience again and again. This dependence can prevent both individuals from truly seeing each other. The mind focuses on how the person makes it feel, rather than understanding who the person actually is. True love grows through awareness. It develops when two individuals learn about each other's values, perspectives, and experiences over time. It requires patience because understanding another human being cannot happen instantly. It also requires acceptance of complexity. Every person carries strengths, weaknesses, fears, and aspirations that reveal themselves gradually. When the mind is focused mainly on emotional relief, it may overlook these deeper layers of the person. The relationship becomes centered on the comfort they provide rather than the person themselves. This is one reason some relationships begin with intense emotional closeness but later struggle to deepen. The early connection was built on the experience of relief rather than genuine knowledge of each other. As life continues, both individuals begin to reveal parts of themselves that were not visible in the beginning. Differences in values, communication styles, or emotional needs may appear. When this happens, the sense of comfort may decrease. The mind interprets this change as the loss of love, but in many cases, the original experience was not love in the deeper sense. It was emotional relief. Understanding this distinction does not diminish the beauty of connection. It simply reveals how the mind sometimes builds powerful attachments around the removal of emotional discomfort. Many people encounter this pattern after periods of loneliness. When someone finally provides companionship and attention, the mind feels a sudden shift from isolation to connection. That shift produces a powerful, pleasant sensation. Because the change feels dramatic, the mind assumes the relationship must be deeply meaningful. But the emotional intensity came from the contrast between loneliness and companionship. The person did not create the entire emotional experience. They participated in a moment when emotional conditions changed. Buddhist teachings encourage recognizing how emotional relief arises. When tension dissolves, the mind feels peace. But the peace was always possible within the mind itself. The other person helped create the conditions where that peace appeared. Recognizing this allows the mind to appreciate connection without becoming dependent on it. Love becomes less about receiving emotional stability and more about sharing life with another human being. Two individuals support each other, but neither becomes the sole source of emotional balance. When love grows in this way, it becomes more resilient. The relationship is not threatened by every change in emotional atmosphere. Moments of tension can occur without destroying the sense of connection. Periods of calm can appear naturally rather than being demanded. The bond becomes rooted in understanding rather than relief alone. Another difference between love and emotional relief lies in how each responds to change. Emotional relief seeks stability above all else. The mind wants the comforting feeling to remain exactly as it was. Love, on the other hand, recognizes that both people will continue to grow and evolve. The relationship adapts as each individual develops. Love allows space for change. Relief tries to prevent it. This distinction becomes especially important over time. Life inevitably brings new experiences that shape who people become. If a relationship depends entirely on maintaining the same emotional comfort that existed at the beginning, it may struggle to adapt. But when connection is rooted in genuine understanding, the relationship can grow alongside both individuals. Another sign of the difference between relief and love appears in how the mind responds to absence. When attachment is based on emotional comfort, separation often produces anxiety. The mind worries that the emotional stability provided by the other person will disappear. But when love grows from understanding, absence does not erase the connection. Trust and respect continue even when the person is not present. The relationship becomes less about immediate emotional regulation and more about shared meaning. This does not mean that love eliminates the desire for closeness, but the desire becomes less dependent on maintaining a specific emotional state. The presence of the other person is valued for who they are, not only for how they make the mind feel. Recognizing this difference can transform how the mind approaches relationships. Instead of asking who provides the most comfort, the mind begins asking deeper questions. Who truly understands my values? Who shares a vision of life that resonates with mine? Who encourages growth rather than simply calming my fears? These questions lead the mind toward relationships built on genuine connection. Emotional relief may still appear within those relationships. Comfort and safety are natural parts of human bonding, but they are no longer mistaken for the entire meaning of love. They become one element among many within a deeper connection. As awareness grows, the mind begins to see that emotional comfort is only the beginning of understanding another person. The quiet peace someone brings into your life can be appreciated, but love becomes something larger than that peace alone. It becomes the willingness to see another person clearly, to understand their strengths and vulnerabilities, to support their growth while continuing your own. And when this understanding develops, the relationship no longer depends solely on the feeling of relief. It becomes a shared journey shaped by awareness, patience, and mutual respect. In that space, love no longer needs to be confused with the temporary comfort that first brought two people together. As the mind begins to recognize the difference between loving a person and loving the emotional relief they provide, another subtle discovery begins to emerge. Emotional comfort does not only influence how we see others, it also quietly shapes how we see ourselves. When certain feelings repeatedly appear in the presence of someone, the mind slowly begins to connect those emotions with personal identity. The feeling no longer seems like a temporary experience passing through the mind. It starts to feel like part of who we are. And when that emotional environment changes, the loss can feel deeper than expected because the mind believes something about the self has disappeared. A quiet transformation often begins without anyone noticing it. In the early stages of a relationship, certain emotions begin appearing more frequently. Perhaps someone begins to feel calmer when they are around a particular person. Perhaps confidence grows during conversations with them. Perhaps a sense of belonging appears that had been missing for a long time. These emotional shifts feel natural at first. They appear like pleasant experiences happening within the flow of life. But over time, the mind begins to interpret these emotions differently. Instead of seeing them as temporary states, the mind begins attaching them to identity. A person may start thinking of themselves as happier when they are with someone. They may believe they are more confident, more relaxed, or more alive because of that connection. Slowly, the emotional environment created within the relationship becomes woven into the story the mind tells about itself. The mind begins to form statements that shape identity. Life feels complete when I am with them. I feel like myself when they are here. I become a better version of who I am because of them. At first, these thoughts may appear romantic or meaningful. They reflect appreciation for how someone influences emotional life. But beneath these thoughts, something deeper is happening. The mind is merging temporary emotional states with the sense of self. This merging creates a powerful form of attachment. When emotions become part of identity, the mind begins protecting the relationship not only because of affection, but because it believes the connection defines who it is. If the relationship changes, the mind fears losing a part of itself. This is why separation can sometimes feel like an identity crisis. The mind is not only grieving the absence of another person, it is struggling to understand who it is without the emotional environment that relationship created. A person who once felt confident within the relationship may suddenly feel uncertain. Someone who felt calm may experience anxiety again. The mind interprets these changes as evidence that something essential has been taken away. But the deeper truth is that the emotional states were never permanent parts of identity. They were temporary experiences arising under specific conditions. The relationship created an environment where certain emotions appeared more frequently. When the environment changed, the emotional pattern changed as well. Yet the mind had already connected those emotions to the idea of self. This connection between emotional states and identity begins very early in human life. From childhood, the mind learns to interpret emotional experiences as reflections of who we are. If someone receives encouragement and warmth from others, the mind may develop the belief that it is worthy or valued. If someone experiences criticism or rejection, the mind may interpret those feelings as signs of personal inadequacy. Over time, emotional experiences shape the identity that the mind constructs. Relationships later in life continue influencing this process. When someone enters a relationship that brings emotional stability, the mind begins updating its self-story. It may believe that it has finally become a happier or more secure person, but the emotional stability often comes from the interaction between two individuals rather than from a permanent transformation of identity. The environment of the relationship supports certain emotions. Without realizing it, the mind credits the relationship with creating a new version of the self. This interpretation strengthens attachment because the mind now believes the relationship defines personal identity. Buddhist teachings often emphasize that the sense of self is not fixed. Identity is continuously shaped by experiences, thoughts, and emotional conditions. What we call the self is actually a collection of changing processes rather than a permanent essence. Emotions are one of those processes. They arise when certain conditions appear and dissolve when those conditions change. But the mind prefers stability. It tries to organize experiences into a consistent identity. When an emotional state appears repeatedly in a relationship, the mind begins incorporating it into the idea of who we are. For example, someone may feel deeply appreciated within a relationship. The mind may then adopt the belief that it is finally recognized and valued. The emotional experience becomes part of the personal narrative. I'm someone who is loved. I am someone who is understood. These beliefs feel deeply meaningful because they are supported by repeated emotional experiences. But if the relationship ends or changes, the emotional conditions supporting those beliefs may also shift. Without the same interactions producing the familiar feelings, the mind may begin questioning the identity it built around them. A person who once felt valued may suddenly feel uncertain again. The mind interprets this shift as a loss of identity rather than a change in emotional conditions. This confusion can create powerful emotional distress. The mind tries to recover the emotional state that once defined the sense of self. It may long for the relationship not only because of affection, but because it believes that relationship confirmed who it was. Understanding this process reveals something important about attachment. Attachment is not only about losing someone else, it is also about losing the emotional identity that the relationship seemed to provide. When the mind realizes this, it begins to see how temporary emotional experiences became woven into the idea of self. This realization does not mean that relationships lack significance. Connections with others deeply influence emotional life. But identity itself does not need to depend on those emotional environments. The qualities that appeared within the relationship, calmness, confidence, openness, were always possible within the mind. The relationship simply created conditions where those qualities emerged more easily. When the mind sees this clearly, it begins to reclaim those qualities as part of its own capacity rather than as gifts that belong to another person. The calm that appeared during conversations was not owned by the relationship. It arose because the mind felt safe enough to relax. The confidence that appeared in their presence was not something they created from nothing. It emerged because the environment allowed self-expression. Once this becomes visible, identity begins to shift again. Instead of believing that emotional states belong to relationships, the mind begins recognizing them as temporary expressions of inner conditions. Confidence can appear again under different circumstances. Calmness can arise through awareness and understanding. The qualities that once seemed tied to another person become accessible in new ways. This recognition loosens the belief that identity depends on a specific emotional environment. The mind begins to see itself not as a fixed personality shaped by relationships, but as a dynamic process capable of many different states. Some of those states may have been revealed within relationships. Others may appear through personal reflection, creativity, learning, or solitude. Identity becomes less rigid. Instead of defining the self through past emotional experiences, the mind begins exploring the many possibilities that awareness contains. This shift creates a quiet sense of freedom. The mind no longer feels trapped within the identity that formed inside a particular relationship. It begins to recognize that emotional states are temporary movements within consciousness rather than permanent traits. The calm person, the joyful person, the confident person, and the uncertain person are all expressions that can appear under different conditions. None of them represent the entire identity of the self. This understanding also transforms how relationships are experienced in the future. Instead of relying on another person to define identity, the mind approaches connection with greater openness. The relationship becomes a space for shared growth rather than a source of emotional definition. Two individuals meet as evolving human beings rather than as incomplete selves searching for identity. In that environment, connection becomes deeper and more balanced. The presence of another person can still bring joy and emotional richness, but identity no longer depends on maintaining a specific emotional atmosphere. The self remains fluid and adaptable. As awareness grows, the mind begins to see that every emotional experience, whether inside a relationship or outside it, is simply part of the continuous movement of consciousness. Feelings appear, shape experience for a time, and eventually change. Identity, rather than being fixed by those feelings, becomes the open space in which they arise. And when this understanding settles into the mind, the fear of losing oneself within the changing landscape of relationships begins to dissolve. The self is no longer something fragile that depends on emotional environments. It becomes a living awareness, capable of meeting each new moment without needing to hold on to the past. As the mind begins to understand that identity itself can become shaped by temporary emotional states within relationships, another hidden force slowly becomes visible behind many memories of the past. Even when the mind realizes that feelings once associated with someone were never permanent, something still pulls attention backward. Certain moments from the past continue appearing in the mind with unusual intensity. The heart feels a quiet pull toward experiences that can no longer be lived again. This pull does not come from love alone. It comes from something deeper that Buddhist teachings describe very clearly. The force is craving. There is a particular feeling that appears when the mind returns to certain memories. It is not simply sadness, and it is not exactly happiness either. It carries a mixture of warmth and ache at the same time. A song, a familiar place, or even a passing thought can suddenly open the door to a memory that feels emotionally vivid. The mind lingers on the scene. The moment begins to glow with meaning. It may seem as though the past contained something rare and beautiful that has now disappeared. This emotional experience is often described as romantic nostalgia, but beneath nostalgia lies a powerful psychological process. The mind is craving the return of a feeling that once existed. Craving is one of the central ideas in Buddhist understanding of the mind. It refers to the tendency of consciousness to grasp at pleasant experiences and wish they would continue forever. When the mind experiences something enjoyable, it naturally tries to hold on to that experience. It wants the feeling to stay exactly as it was, but life does not operate according to that desire. Experiences pass, moments change, emotions shift with time. When the pleasant experience disappears, the mind begins searching for ways to bring it back. Sometimes this search happens in the present, through new experiences. But often the mind turns to memory instead. It returns to the past and revisits moments that once produced strong emotional warmth. Each time the memory appears, the mind experiences a faint echo of the original feeling. This echo strengthens the desire to experience the full emotion again. The more the mind revisits the memory, the more powerful the craving becomes. This is how nostalgia grows. At first, the memory simply appears, but with repetition, the mind begins to treat the past as something precious that must be preserved. The emotional tone of the memory becomes stronger than the details of the event itself. A short conversation becomes remembered as deeply meaningful. A quiet evening together becomes a symbol of happiness. The mind magnifies the emotional value of those moments. Craving quietly shapes how the past is remembered. Instead of recalling events exactly as they occurred, the mind emphasizes the emotional pleasure that those events once created. Details that do not support the pleasant feeling gradually fade. Moments of tension, disagreement, or confusion disappear from the story. What remains is a memory that feels almost perfect. The brain begins to believe that the past contained a level of emotional fulfillment that the present cannot match. This belief strengthens longing. The mind begins comparing the present moment to the emotional glow of memory. Because the memory has been polished by craving, the present rarely seems equally satisfying. Ordinary moments of life feel less vivid than the emotionally intensified past. This contrast makes the past appear even more valuable. But what the mind is longing for is not truly the relationship itself. It is longing for the emotional experience that once arose within that relationship. Craving does not care about the complexity of real life. It focuses only on the pleasant feeling it wants to repeat. Buddhist teachings describe craving as a force that distorts perception. When craving appears, the mind stops seeing things clearly. It begins focusing only on what supports the desire. In romantic nostalgia, craving encourages the mind to remember emotional peaks while ignoring the rest of the story. The memory becomes shaped by desire rather than by reality. This is why nostalgia can feel so powerful. The mind is not simply remembering the past. It is remembering the past through the lens of craving. The pleasant emotions that once existed are amplified. The circumstances surrounding them are simplified. And the mind begins to believe that the past represented a perfect emotional state that should have continued. But the emotional intensity remembered in nostalgia was never stable. It arose from a specific combination of conditions that existed only during that time. The people involved were in a certain stage of life. Their expectations and perspectives were different. The novelty of the relationship created emotional energy. All of these factors combined to produce the emotional experience that memory now treasures. But those conditions have already changed. Life continues moving forward. The mind, however, continues reaching backward. Craving makes the past feel like a destination that could restore happiness if it were somehow recovered. Yet, even if the past could be revisited, the emotional conditions would not be the same. The people involved have grown and changed. The context of life is different. The emotional state that once existed was a temporary phenomenon. Understanding this helps reveal the true nature of romantic nostalgia. It is not simply appreciation for meaningful experiences. It is the mind's attempt to recover an emotional state that once felt deeply satisfying. But the satisfaction came from the temporary alignment of conditions. Craving tries to repeat the feeling without recognizing that the conditions supporting it have already transformed. This is why nostalgia often feels bittersweet. The memory produces warmth, but it also carries the pain of knowing the experience cannot return exactly as it was. The mind continues wanting something that no longer exists. Buddhist wisdom suggests that suffering arises when craving attaches itself to temporary experiences. The mind tries to hold on to what is naturally changing. When the experience fades, the craving remains. The gap between desire and reality creates emotional tension. In romantic nostalgia, that tension appears as longing. The mind believes the past contained something essential. It feels that life was somehow more meaningful during those moments. But the meaning was not located in the past itself. It was created by the emotional conditions present at that time. Those conditions can appear again in different forms throughout life. But craving prevents the mind from seeing that possibility. Instead of allowing new emotional experiences to unfold, the mind becomes fixated on repeating an old one. This fixation narrows attention. The present moment begins to feel less interesting because the mind is measuring it against a memory that has been intensified by longing. Recognizing the role of craving begins to change how nostalgia is experienced. The mind can still appreciate the past without trying to reclaim it. Memories can remain meaningful without becoming objects of desire. The emotional warmth connected to certain moments can be honored while still accepting that those experiences belonged to a specific time in life. This shift allows nostalgia to become gentler. Instead of pulling the mind backward with longing, memories become quiet reminders of how emotional experiences arise and pass. The past becomes a teacher rather than a destination. It shows how powerful emotions once appeared under certain conditions, but it also reveals that those emotions were never permanent. They arose naturally and eventually dissolved. Understanding this helps the mind release its grip on craving. Instead of searching for lost feelings, awareness begins to observe how emotional experiences appear in the present. New connections can bring warmth. New conversations can produce joy. New moments of understanding can create meaning. When craving loosens its hold on memory, the mind becomes more open to the richness of the present. The emotional beauty of life is no longer limited to what happened before. It begins unfolding again in unexpected ways. And the past, rather than being a source of longing, becomes part of a larger story of changing experiences. Each memory remains valuable, but it no longer controls the direction of the heart. The mind begins to understand that what it truly longed for was not the past itself. It was the feeling that once passed through it. And feelings, like all experiences, are always moving. They appear, they fade, and new ones quietly arise when the mind is ready to meet them. As the mind slowly begins to understand how craving turns memories into powerful emotional magnets, another pattern quietly begins to reveal itself. Even when someone believes they have moved on from the past, there are certain moments when old attachments suddenly return with surprising force. The mind may have spent weeks or even months feeling calm, yet one quiet evening can reopen emotional doors that seemed long closed. This return of memory is not random. It often appears during a very specific emotional condition. When the mind feels empty, when silence becomes heavy, and when loneliness begins to expand, the past can rise again, as if it were offering comfort. A certain quiet can fall over life when the mind begins to feel emotionally alone. Conversations become fewer. The familiar presence of someone who once shared daily experiences is no longer there. Ordinary routines continue, yet something inside the emotional landscape feels unfinished. In these moments, the mind begins searching for relief from the emptiness it feels. But the search rarely begins in the present. Instead, the mind turns backward. Old memories begin to surface with unusual clarity. The face of someone once loved appears in thought. Past conversations begin replaying in quiet detail. Small moments that once seemed insignificant now carry emotional warmth. It can feel as though the mind is remembering something meaningful that should not have been lost. But beneath this process lies something deeper than simple remembrance. Loneliness is activating the mind's search for emotional comfort. The brain is designed to move away from emotional pain whenever possible. When a feeling of emptiness appears, the mind naturally begins looking for experiences that once produced relief. Because the past already contains memories of emotional comfort, the brain returns there first. In other words, loneliness can act like a signal that awakens old attachments. The mind remembers the last place where emotional warmth was experienced. This does not necessarily mean that the relationship itself was perfect or even healthy. It simply means that the mind remembers the emotional relief that appeared in that environment. When loneliness appears, the brain treats past relationships like emotional refuges. The mind begins to imagine that reconnecting with that person would restore the warmth that is currently missing. But this reaction is not truly about the person. It is about the desire to escape the discomfort of emotional emptiness. Loneliness changes the way the mind interprets memory. When someone feels emotionally full and connected to life, memories of past relationships may appear occasionally without strong emotional intensity. They are simply part of the story of life. But when loneliness enters the mind, those same memories become emotionally amplified. The brain begins to search the past for moments that contain warmth, companionship, and understanding. Because the mind is currently lacking those experiences, the contrast between past and present makes the memories feel especially powerful. This contrast creates the illusion that the past contained something irreplaceable. But what the mind is truly noticing is the difference between emotional fullness and emotional emptiness. The past feels warm because the present feels quiet. If the emotional environment of the present were filled with connection and engagement, those same memories would not appear as intensely. This is why loneliness can revive attachments that seem to have disappeared. The mind is not necessarily longing for the relationship itself. It is longing for the emotional relief that the relationship once provided. Understanding this pattern helps explain why certain thoughts appear during quiet moments. A person may suddenly wonder what their former partner is doing. They may feel tempted to revisit old messages or photographs. They may imagine how life might feel if the relationship had continued. These thoughts are not always expressions of love. Often, they are expressions of emotional hunger. The mind senses a lack of connection and searches for the nearest memory that once satisfied that need. Because the memory is familiar, it feels like the most obvious solution. But the emotional warmth remembered from the past was created by conditions that existed at that time. The presence of the person was only one part of those conditions. The stage of life, the emotional openness of both individuals, and the circumstances surrounding the relationship all contributed to the atmosphere that once existed. Loneliness simplifies that story. The mind focuses only on the presence of the person and assumes they were the source of the comfort. This simplification strengthens attachment. The mind begins to believe that reconnecting with the past would solve the emotional emptiness of the present. But loneliness itself is not always caused by the absence of a specific person. It often arises from a deeper lack of emotional engagement with life. When daily routines become repetitive, when meaningful conversation becomes rare, or when the mind spends long periods without emotional stimulation, the feeling of isolation grows stronger. The brain interprets this isolation as a problem that must be solved. Because past relationships once reduced that feeling, the mind treats them as potential solutions. This process can lead people to reach out to former partners or to dwell heavily on memories. But the relief that the mind hopes to recover may not return in the same way. The emotional conditions that existed during the original relationship have changed. Even if two people reconnect, the emotional environment will not be identical to what it once was. This is why reconnecting with the past sometimes produces confusion rather than comfort. The mind expects the emotional warmth of memory, but the reality of the present moment is different. The person has grown, life circumstances have changed. The emotional atmosphere that once existed cannot simply be recreated. Understanding this helps the mind respond to loneliness more wisely. Instead of treating past relationships as the only source of emotional comfort, the mind begins to examine the deeper need that loneliness reveals. Loneliness is often a signal that emotional connection is missing in the present moment. The solution does not necessarily lie in returning to old attachments. It lies in creating new conditions that allow emotional warmth to appear again. Connection can arise in many forms. Meaningful conversations with friends, creative activities, learning new perspectives, and engaging with life in a deeper way can all reduce the sense of isolation. When the mind becomes emotionally engaged with the present, the intensity of past attachments begins to soften. Memories still exist, but they no longer appear as urgent solutions to emotional discomfort. They return to their natural place as parts of the past rather than imagined refuges. Buddhist teachings often encourage observing loneliness with curiosity rather than fear. Instead of immediately trying to escape the feeling, the mind can examine what the experience reveals. Loneliness often carries information about emotional needs that have not been met. The mind may be seeking understanding, companionship, or meaningful conversation. When these needs are acknowledged, new forms of connection can begin to appear. The past no longer needs to carry the entire weight of emotional comfort. Life in the present becomes capable of producing new warmth. This shift changes how the mind experiences memories. Instead of feeling pulled backward by longing, the mind can appreciate past relationships as experiences that once contributed to emotional growth. The warmth remembered from those moments is no longer treated as something lost forever. It becomes evidence that the mind is capable of experiencing deep connection. That capacity still exists. It simply requires new conditions to appear again. When loneliness is understood this way, it stops being an enemy. It becomes a signal inviting the mind to reconnect with life in new ways. The past no longer needs to be revived as a source of relief. Instead, the mind becomes open to the possibility that emotional warmth can arise again through new experiences, new conversations, and new forms of understanding. And as this awareness deepens, the power of old attachments gradually fades. Memories remain, but they no longer appear as solutions to emotional emptiness. They become quiet reminders of moments that once existed within the larger movement of life. The mind learns that the warmth it once experienced was never limited to one relationship. It was a natural expression of connection itself. And connection can appear again whenever the mind allows life to be lived fully in the present. As the mind begins to understand how loneliness can awaken memories of past relationships, another pattern quietly becomes visible beneath the surface. The return of those memories does not simply happen once and disappear. Instead, the mind often begins revisiting them again and again. Each time the memory appears, the emotional atmosphere surrounding it seems to grow stronger. What began as a brief thought slowly turns into a repeated cycle. The mind remembers, feels something familiar, and then returns to the memory once more. Without noticing it, the brain enters a loop where recalling the past begins strengthening the very emotions that keep the attachment alive. There is a moment when a memory first appears in the mind. It may arrive suddenly during a quiet walk, during a song that once carried meaning, or during an ordinary pause in the day when thoughts drift toward the past. At first, the memory may feel gentle and harmless. A face appears in the mind. A moment of laughter or conversation quietly surfaces. The mind observes it briefly and continues with the day. But sometimes the emotional tone connected to that memory is strong enough to capture attention. The mind begins examining the memory more closely. What exactly happened during that moment? What was said? How did it feel? As the brain explores these questions, the emotional atmosphere connected to the memory begins returning as well. The same warmth, sadness, or longing that once existed during the original experience begins to reappear in a softer form. This is where the psychological loop of emotional recall begins. The mind is not simply remembering the past. It is recreating the emotional state associated with that memory. Every time a memory is recalled, the brain activates many of the same neural pathways that were active during the original experience. In other words, remembering a moment is not very different from emotionally reliving it. This means that the act of remembering someone can quietly reproduce the feelings connected to them. If the memory carries warmth, the mind may briefly feel that warmth again. If the memory carries longing, the mind may experience that longing again. This emotional recreation strengthens the connection between the person and the feeling. The brain begins reinforcing the emotional link through repetition. Each time the memory appears, the emotional pattern becomes more familiar, and familiarity strengthens attachment. The mind slowly begins to believe that the emotional state belongs to the person in the memory. This belief deepens longing. Because the feeling appears during the act of remembering, the mind concludes that the person is still connected to the emotional experience, but the feeling is actually being generated by the mind itself. The brain is recreating the emotional environment internally. This process can become self-reinforcing. The more the mind remembers the person, the stronger the emotional response becomes. The stronger the emotional response becomes, the more likely the mind is to remember the person again. In this way, emotional recall becomes a loop. Memory produces feeling. Feeling produces more memory. The mind becomes caught in a repeating cycle. This loop can continue even when the person is no longer present in life. The relationship may have ended long ago, yet the emotional connection seems to remain alive because the mind continues recreating it through memory. Many people interpret this experience as proof that the attachment is deep or meaningful. But what is actually happening is the repetition of emotional recall. The mind is strengthening a pattern through repeated activation. Each time the brain revisits the memory, the emotional association becomes slightly stronger. The neural pathways involved in that memory become easier to activate again. Over time, the memory becomes highly accessible. A small reminder, a place, a song, or even a quiet moment of reflection can immediately trigger the emotional pattern. The mind returns to the memory almost automatically. This is why certain thoughts feel difficult to let go of. It is not simply that the memory exists. It is that the mind has practiced returning to it many times. The brain has learned the path toward that emotional state. Buddhist psychology often describes this process as the strengthening of mental habits. When a thought pattern is repeated, the mind becomes accustomed to traveling that path. The repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity makes the thought easier to return to again. Emotional recall functions in the same way. Each time the mind revisits a memory connected to a person, it reinforces the habit of remembering them. The emotional tone of the memory becomes stronger with repetition. Eventually, the memory may appear almost automatically whenever the mind becomes quiet. But the key to understanding this loop lies in recognizing that memory and emotion are interacting continuously. The memory brings the feeling strengthens the memory. Together they create the experience of attachment. This process explains why certain people seem impossible to forget. The mind has not only stored the memory, it has practiced reliving it repeatedly. The emotional recall has become a familiar mental habit. Breaking this loop requires awareness. The mind must first recognize that remembering someone is not a neutral act. It is an emotional activity that recreates the feeling connected to the memory. When the mind understands this, it begins to observe the process differently. Instead of automatically following the memory deeper into emotional recall, awareness pauses. The mind notices the moment when the memory appears. It observes the emotional tone beginning to rise. Rather than feeding the memory with additional attention, the mind allows the feeling to pass. This interruption weakens the loop. Without repeated emotional recall, the memory gradually loses its intensity. The neural pathways connected to the memory are activated less often. Over time, the emotional association becomes softer. The memory remains part of the mind, but it no longer carries the same emotional weight. This process does not erase the past. It simply changes the relationship the mind has with memory. Instead of reliving the emotional environment repeatedly, the mind begins seeing the memory as something that once occurred. It becomes a part of history rather than a present emotional experience. Understanding emotional recall also reveals why certain triggers can feel powerful. When something in the environment resembles a past experience, it activates the memory automatically. The mind may not even realize why the feeling has appeared. A particular scent, a familiar street, or even the rhythm of a song can awaken the emotional pattern connected to a person. The brain associates these external cues with the memory stored in emotional networks. When the cue appears, the mind begins recreating the emotional state linked to it. This is another way the recall loop continues. The environment provides reminders. The mind responds with memory. Memory recreates emotion. Emotion strengthens the attachment. Recognizing this pattern helps the mind respond more gently to emotional triggers. Instead of interpreting the return of a memory as a sign that something must be done, awareness simply notices the process. The memory has appeared. The feeling has followed. But both are temporary mental events. They arise within awareness and eventually fade when they are not reinforced. This understanding changes how attachment is experienced. Instead of feeling controlled by memories, the mind begins observing the mechanics of recall itself. It sees how attention feeds emotional patterns, and with that insight, the mind gains the freedom to redirect attention toward the present moment. New experiences begin creating new emotional associations. The brain gradually forms different pathways that do not revolve around the past. The loop of emotional recall slowly loses its influence. What once felt like an unbreakable attachment becomes a pattern that the mind has learned to recognize and release. The person who once seemed impossible to stop thinking about becomes simply another memory among many. The emotional intensity fades, not because the past was meaningless, but because the mind has stopped reliving it repeatedly. And when the loop of recall weakens, something else quietly appears. Attention begins returning to the present. Life becomes filled again with experiences that are not tied to the past. New emotions arise naturally from new conditions. The mind realizes that it no longer needs to recreate the same emotional state again and again. The cycle that once deepened attachment slowly dissolves. What remains is a clearer understanding of how memory and emotion interact within the mind. And with that clarity, the heart begins to experience the past without being trapped inside it. As the mind begins to see how emotional recall quietly keeps attachments alive through repetition, another realization begins to emerge beneath the surface. Even when the loop of memory weakens, something interesting can still remain. The person may no longer be present in life, conversations may have ended, and the relationship itself may belong to the past. Yet certain feelings connected to that experience still appear from time to time. A sudden warmth, a familiar sadness, a trace of longing, or even a brief sense of comfort can arise without the person being anywhere near. This reveals something important that Buddhist teachings have observed for centuries. Emotions do not belong to people. They belong to the patterns that continue living inside the mind. There is often a moment after a relationship ends when someone begins to notice something strange about their emotional world. At first, the mind may assume that the emotional connection will disappear as soon as the person leaves. The logic seems simple. If the person who created the feeling is gone, then the feeling itself should vanish as well. But experience rarely follows that expectation. Days pass, then weeks, and sometimes even months or years later, emotions connected to the relationship still appear. A quiet evening may bring a familiar, emotional tone. A memory may trigger a sudden sense of warmth. A passing thought may produce a moment of sadness that feels strangely connected to someone who is no longer part of daily life. This can confuse the mind. It may wonder why the emotional connection still exists if the person is gone. But this confusion comes from a misunderstanding about where emotions originate. The mind often believes that people are the source of emotions. It assumes that love, comfort, excitement, or sadness come directly from the presence of another person. But Buddhist insight suggests something different. Emotions arise within the mind itself. Other people may trigger certain emotional responses, but the emotions themselves are created inside consciousness. When a relationship exists, the presence of the other person becomes a condition that repeatedly activates certain emotional patterns. Perhaps the relationship created a sense of safety. Perhaps it encouraged openness or joy. Perhaps it activated feelings of belonging that had not been experienced before. Each time those emotions appeared, the brain strengthened the pattern that produced them. Over time, the mind learned to associate those emotional states with the person. It began to believe that the emotions belonged to the relationship. But the emotional patterns themselves were being stored inside the mind. When the relationship ended, the patterns did not disappear. They remained within the emotional structure of the brain. This is why feelings connected to someone can continue appearing long after they are gone. The mind has learned the emotional pattern. It knows how to recreate it. Certain thoughts, memories, or even moods can activate the pattern again. The person who originally triggered the emotion may no longer be present, but the emotional habit still exists. This understanding changes the way attachment is interpreted. Many people believe they are still emotionally connected to someone because the feelings remain. But the feelings do not necessarily indicate an ongoing bond with the person. They reveal the presence of emotional patterns that the mind learned during the relationship. The patterns remain until the mind gradually releases them or replaces them with new experiences. Buddhist psychology often explains that the mind functions through conditioned patterns. Every experience leaves traces within consciousness. These traces influence how emotions arise in the future. When a relationship repeatedly activates certain feelings, the brain becomes familiar with those emotional states. The mind begins to access them easily. Even after the external relationship ends, the internal pattern can continue functioning. This explains why people sometimes feel emotions connected to someone they have not seen in years. The emotional habit still exists, but understanding this insight can also bring relief. If emotions belong to patterns within the mind rather than to another person, then the presence of those feelings does not mean that the relationship must continue. It simply means that the mind has not yet fully released the emotional pattern. Releasing emotional patterns requires time and awareness. The mind gradually weakens the pattern when it stops feeding it through constant memory or emotional recall. When attention moves toward new experiences and new relationships with life, the old emotional patterns become less active. They appear less often. Their intensity slowly decreases. Eventually, they become quiet traces of the past rather than powerful emotional forces. This process happens naturally as the mind grows and adapts. New experiences create new emotional pathways. Different relationships produce different emotional environments. The brain continues learning and reshaping its patterns. But the realization that emotions remain within the mind after people leave carries another important lesson. It shows that emotional experiences are not controlled by external circumstances alone. The capacity for love, warmth, and connection exists within the mind itself. A relationship may have helped reveal those qualities, but it did not create them from nothing. The emotional openness that appeared during the relationship was always possible within consciousness. The presence of another person simply made it easier for those qualities to emerge. When the relationship ends, the qualities themselves do not disappear. They remain part of the mind's potential. The same capacity for connection can appear again in different forms. This understanding helps transform the meaning of past relationships. Instead of seeing them as the only place where certain emotions existed, the mind begins recognizing them as experiences that revealed emotional capacities that already lived within. Love becomes something the mind can experience again under new conditions. Warmth becomes something that can arise through different connections. Emotional openness becomes a quality that can appear whenever the mind feels safe enough to express it. The person who once triggered those emotions becomes part of the story of how the mind discovered those possibilities. But the emotions themselves are not locked in the past. They remain available to life. Buddhist teachings often emphasize that the mind is constantly shaping emotional reality through conditions and attention. When attention repeatedly returns to the past, old emotional patterns remain active. When attention begins engaging with new experiences, different emotional patterns begin forming. When attention begins engaging with new experiences, different emotional patterns begin forming. The mind gradually shifts its emotional landscape. Understanding this process removes the fear that emotions tied to someone will remain forever. They persist only as long as the conditions that support them continue. When those conditions change, the emotional patterns slowly dissolve. This does not mean forgetting the past. Memories remain part of the mind's history. But the emotional energy attached to those memories becomes lighter. They become reflections rather than emotional currents, pulling the mind backward. The person who once felt like the center of emotional life becomes part of a broader understanding of how emotions arise and change. The mind begins to see that emotional experiences are not possessions belonging to specific people. They are movements within consciousness, responding to conditions. People come into life and activate certain emotional states. When they leave, the patterns remain for a time. But the mind continues evolving. New conditions create new emotional possibilities, and slowly the understanding deepens that emotional life is not limited to what once existed. The mind itself contains the capacity for many different experiences of connection, warmth, and meaning. The past may have revealed those possibilities, but it does not define them forever. And when this insight settles into awareness, attachment begins to soften in a very natural way. The heart no longer believes that the source of its emotions was taken away. It begins to see that the emotions were always part of its own living landscape. People may come and go through the story of life, but the emotional capacity of the mind continues moving, changing, and unfolding in new directions. What once seemed lost begins to appear again in different forms. And the mind gradually learns that emotional experience belongs to the flow of consciousness itself, not to any single person who once passed through it. As the mind begins to recognize that emotions continue existing inside consciousness even after people leave, another subtle habit starts to become visible. Even though emotional patterns live within the mind, people often still believe that certain individuals possess a special power over those emotions. The mind may quietly assume that one specific person was the only source of a certain feeling. Calm may feel tied to one voice. Joy may feel connected to one presence. A sense of safety may seem as if it belonged to a particular relationship. Yet when this belief is examined closely, something important becomes clear. The feeling did not belong to the person. The mind simply learned to associate the emotion with them. A quiet thought often appears when people reflect on past relationships. It sounds simple, yet it carries a deep emotional assumption. Someone may say that no one else ever made them feel the same way. They may believe that a particular person brought out a version of themselves that cannot appear again. The feeling may seem so unique that it becomes tied entirely to the individual who once triggered it. This belief feels convincing because the mind remembers how powerful those emotions once were. When a relationship produces strong emotional experiences, the brain tries to understand where those feelings came from. The simplest explanation is to connect the feeling directly to the person who was present when it appeared. The mind begins forming associations. If a person felt deeply understood during conversations with someone, the brain connects that feeling of understanding with the individual. If someone felt unusually calm in the presence of another person, the mind begins linking calmness with that person. Over time, these associations become strong mental shortcuts. Instead of recognizing the emotional experience as something created within the mind, the brain assumes the person themselves carries the ability to produce that feeling. This is the habit of assigning emotional meaning to individuals. It is one of the most powerful habits the mind develops during relationships. Once the association forms, the brain begins to treat the person as if they contain the emotional quality. The mind may begin believing that a certain person is the source of happiness, confidence, peace, or emotional warmth. But in reality, the person is simply one of the conditions that allowed those emotions to arise. The emotional state itself was created by the interaction between the mind, the environment, and the moment. Yet the mind prefers simple explanations. It is easier to say that someone made a person happy than to examine the complex psychological conditions that allowed happiness to appear. This simplification creates attachment. When the mind believes that a specific person contains the ability to produce certain emotions, losing that person feels like losing access to the feeling itself. The brain interprets the absence of the person as the disappearance of the emotional experience, but the emotional capacity still exists inside the mind. The association between the person and the emotion simply made it easier for that feeling to appear. Understanding this habit requires observing how the mind forms emotional links. When people spend time together repeatedly, the brain begins connecting their presence with the emotional states experienced during those moments. If the relationship contains laughter and comfort, the brain learns to expect those feelings whenever the person appears. Over time, the emotional pattern becomes automatic. Seeing the person may immediately produce warmth because the brain has learned the association, but the emotional warmth is still arising from internal processes. The person simply acts as a trigger. This pattern is similar to how certain songs or places can produce emotional responses. A particular location may remind someone of a meaningful moment in their life. When they return to that place years later, the emotional tone connected to that memory may appear again. But the place itself does not contain the emotion. The mind has simply stored the association between the environment and the feeling. The same process occurs with people. The brain connects emotional experiences with the individuals who were present when those feelings appeared. Because human relationships involve powerful emotional interactions, the associations formed with people often become stronger than those formed with places or objects. This strength makes the emotional connection feel unique. Someone may believe that only one person could produce a certain emotional experience. But if the conditions that created that feeling are understood, it becomes clear that other relationships could produce similar emotional states in different ways. For example, someone may believe that a former partner was the only person who ever made them feel truly understood. But the deeper condition behind that feeling may have been open communication, mutual attention, and emotional honesty. Those conditions can exist in other relationships as well. The mind simply connected them strongly with the person who first triggered the experience. When this connection becomes deeply embedded, it creates the illusion that emotional qualities belong to individuals. A person may begin thinking that someone else possesses the power to make them feel complete. But emotional completeness is not something another person carries inside them. It arises when certain psychological conditions appear. When the mind feels accepted, safe, and emotionally open, a sense of wholeness can appear naturally. Another person may help create that environment, but the feeling itself is generated by the mind. Recognizing this breaks one of the strongest illusions behind attachment. The mind begins to see that emotional experiences are not owned by individuals. They are patterns that arise when certain conditions align. Once those conditions are understood, the emotional state can appear again in different contexts. Another relationship may create similar feelings of understanding. Different conversations may produce the same sense of connection. Emotional warmth may appear in friendships, creative experiences, or meaningful interactions with life itself. But as long as the mind believes that a specific person uniquely possesses those emotional qualities, it remains attached to the past. It may believe that no one else could ever create the same emotional environment. This belief limits the mind's openness to new experiences. Buddhist insight encourages observing how emotional meaning is assigned to people. When awareness watches the process closely, it becomes clear that the mind is constantly creating associations. If someone appears during moments of happiness, the brain links that happiness to them. If someone appears during moments of stress, the brain may link tension to them. These emotional assignments shape how relationships are perceived, but they are not permanent truths. They are learned patterns created through repeated experiences. Once the mind recognizes this, the emotional grip of past associations begins to soften. The person who once seemed like the only source of a particular feeling becomes part of a broader understanding of how emotional patterns form. The mind begins to see that emotional experiences arise from complex interactions between attention, perception, and psychological openness. People participate in that process, but they do not own the emotions themselves. This realization creates emotional freedom. Instead of believing that happiness depends on finding a specific person, the mind becomes curious about the conditions that allow emotional richness to appear. Connection becomes something that can arise in many forms. Warmth can appear in unexpected conversations. Understanding can appear in new friendships. Peace can arise in quiet reflection. The emotional qualities once associated with a single person become recognized as possibilities within the mind itself. This shift also transforms how future relationships are experienced. Instead of searching for someone who will recreate a past emotional pattern, the mind becomes open to discovering new emotional environments. Each relationship becomes a unique interaction rather than an attempt to reproduce a previous feeling. Connection becomes more authentic because it is no longer compared to an imagined emotional standard from the past. People are seen as individuals rather than as sources of specific emotions. The mind stops assigning emotional meaning to them as if they carry emotional powers. Instead, it observes how interactions create conditions where certain feelings can arise naturally. This understanding brings a deeper form of appreciation. Relationships are no longer valued because they provide a particular emotional state. They are valued because they create opportunities for shared experience and mutual understanding. Emotions become something that flows through those experiences rather than something owned by another person. As awareness continues observing these patterns, the illusion that someone uniquely possesses the power to create certain feelings begins to fade. The mind recognizes that emotional life is far more fluid than it once believed. The same warmth that once appeared in one relationship can appear again under different circumstances. The same sense of connection can emerge through entirely new interactions. And slowly, the heart begins to release the belief that emotional meaning belongs to individuals. It begins to see that emotions are movements within the mind responding to the conditions of life. People may participate in those movements, but the emotional experience itself belongs to the living awareness that continues evolving with every new moment. As the mind begins to see that people do not truly possess emotional meanings, another deeper layer of attachment slowly becomes visible. When someone believes a person is the source of certain feelings, what they are often protecting is not the person themselves, but the emotional balance that appeared around that relationship. The calm, the sense of stability, the feeling that life suddenly made more sense. These emotional states can feel fragile. When the mind experiences them for the first time or after a long period of emotional struggle, it may begin holding tightly to whatever seems to keep those feelings alive. What appears as attachment to a person is often something more subtle. It is the fear that without them, the emotional stability the mind discovered will disappear. A quiet transformation often happens when someone enters a relationship that brings emotional relief. Before the relationship began, the mind may have been restless. Thoughts may have been scattered. Life may have felt uncertain or emotionally uneven. Then slowly, through repeated interactions, a new emotional atmosphere begins to form. Conversations may bring clarity, shared experiences may create comfort, moments of laughter may soften the tension that once lived inside the mind. Without realizing it, the emotional landscape begins changing. The mind starts feeling calmer. Daily life may begin to feel more stable. Certain worries may fade into the background. The presence of the other person becomes associated with emotional balance. When the mind experiences this stability repeatedly, it begins forming a powerful psychological link. The person becomes connected to the feeling of internal order. The mind begins believing that the relationship itself is what holds emotional balance together. This belief feels natural. After all, the emotional change seemed to appear when the relationship began, but something deeper is happening. The emotional stability is not actually stored inside the person. It is being created within the mind through the conditions the relationship provides. The environment of understanding, attention, and shared experience allows the nervous system to relax. The brain begins regulating emotional responses more smoothly. Thoughts slow down. Feelings become easier to process. But instead of recognizing these internal processes, the mind simplifies the story. It tells itself that the other person is responsible for the stability. This belief can quietly transform appreciation into attachment. Appreciation recognizes that a relationship supports emotional well-being. Attachment begins fearing that emotional stability will collapse if the person leaves. Once this fear appears, the mind begins protecting the relationship with unusual intensity. Small signs of distance may produce anxiety. Changes in communication may create emotional unease. The mind becomes alert to any possibility that the relationship might end. This reaction is not always about losing the person themselves. It is about losing the emotional equilibrium that the relationship helped create. When someone feels emotionally balanced within a relationship, the nervous system becomes accustomed to that environment. The brain learns what it feels like to exist without constant emotional turbulence. If the relationship suddenly changes, the mind fears returning to the unstable emotional state that existed before. This fear can create powerful attachment. The mind may begin holding on to the relationship not because it deeply understands the person, but because it wants to preserve the internal calm it discovered. Buddhist insight often explains attachment as a form of clinging. The mind clings to experiences that produce comfort. It tries to prevent those experiences from changing. But life is constantly moving. Relationships evolve, circumstances shift, people grow in different directions. When attachment is built around preserving emotional stability, change begins to feel threatening. The mind may interpret normal changes in the relationship as signs of danger. A delayed message may produce worry. A brief misunderstanding may trigger emotional panic. The mind reacts strongly because it believes its internal balance is at risk. But the emotional stability that appeared during the relationship was never entirely dependent on the other person. The relationship simply created conditions that allowed the mind to experience balance. Those conditions may have included open communication, emotional safety, mutual respect, or a shared sense of meaning. When those conditions existed, the mind was able to settle, the nervous system relaxed, thoughts became clearer. But the ability to experience emotional stability was always present within the mind itself. The relationship helped reveal it. The challenge arises when the mind believes that emotional stability can only exist inside that specific connection. This belief leads to fear. The mind begins worrying about what will happen if the relationship changes or ends. Instead of enjoying the connection freely, attention becomes focused on preserving it. The mind may begin sacrificing its own needs to avoid conflict. It may tolerate unhealthy patterns simply to keep the emotional environment intact. But emotional stability built on fear is fragile. True stability cannot depend entirely on external circumstances. When emotional balance depends only on another person's presence, the mind becomes vulnerable to constant uncertainty. Any shift in the relationship threatens the internal sense of calm. Understanding this reveals a deeper truth about attachment. Attachment is often the mind's attempt to protect emotional equilibrium. The relationship becomes a structure that supports inner balance. Losing that structure feels like losing the ground beneath one's feet. But emotional stability can grow stronger when the mind learns to cultivate balance internally. Practices such as reflection, mindfulness, and emotional awareness help the mind regulate itself without relying completely on external conditions. The mind begins discovering that calm can arise through understanding. Clarity can appear through observation. Emotional steadiness can develop through patience and self-awareness. Relationships can still support these qualities, but they no longer become the only place where stability exists. When the mind understands this, attachment begins loosening naturally. The relationship becomes something to appreciate rather than something to cling to. The fear of losing emotional balance fades because the mind begins trusting its own ability to remain steady. Even when relationships change, the internal capacity for calm remains available. This shift creates a different experience of connection. Instead of holding on to someone to maintain emotional stability, the mind approaches relationships with openness. Connection becomes a shared experience rather than a protective structure. Both individuals can grow without the pressure of carrying the other person's emotional balance. This kind of connection feels lighter. It allows affection to exist without fear. Appreciation replaces anxiety. The relationship becomes a place where emotional warmth can appear naturally rather than a system designed to prevent emotional collapse. Understanding the role of emotional stability in attachment also changes how the mind views past relationships. Instead of seeing them only as lost sources of comfort, the mind begins recognizing them as experiences that revealed the possibility of emotional balance. The calm that once appeared within the relationship becomes evidence that the mind is capable of stability. That capacity does not disappear when the relationship ends. It simply needs new conditions to emerge again. Over time, the mind learns that emotional balance is not something another person owns. It is something that arises when awareness, understanding, and supportive environments come together. Relationships can contribute to that environment, but they do not control it. The mind begins discovering that stability can exist in many areas of life. Meaningful work, creative expression, friendships, personal reflection, and quiet moments of presence can all contribute to emotional balance. The nervous system learns that calm does not belong to one specific relationship. It is a state the mind can return to again and again. As this realization deepens, attachment loses its urgency. The mind no longer fears that emotional stability will vanish if a relationship changes. Instead, it recognizes that stability grows from within and can be supported by many different aspects of life. Relationships become valuable not because they protect emotional balance, but because they allow two individuals to share their evolving emotional worlds. Connection becomes more genuine. The pressure to preserve stability disappears. And the heart begins to understand that attachment was never truly about the person alone. It was about the mind's desire to hold on to the feeling of inner balance that once appeared when life briefly felt steady and clear. As the mind begins to understand that attachment often grows from the desire to protect emotional stability, another quiet belief begins to reveal itself. Many people carry a deep conviction that certain emotional connections are once-in-a-lifetime experiences. The mind may believe that the way it felt with one person can never appear again. The relationship may seem special, rare, and impossible to replace. This belief feels powerful because the emotions experienced during that time were real and meaningful. Yet Buddhist understanding gently invites the mind to look deeper. The emotions themselves were not owned by the person. They arose because certain conditions came together at the same moment in life. There are moments in life when connection with another person feels almost magical. Conversations may flow effortlessly. Silence may feel comfortable rather than awkward. Laughter appears easily, and even ordinary activities begin to carry emotional warmth. The mind notices that something unusual is happening. A sense of closeness develops quickly. The emotional atmosphere feels safe. The presence of the other person seems to bring a feeling that is difficult to describe. Because the experience feels rare, the mind begins assigning special meaning to the connection. It may believe that the relationship is unique in a way that cannot be repeated. The feeling becomes labeled as something extraordinary. Many people describe this as meeting someone who understands them in a way no one else ever has. The emotional experience feels so strong that the mind begins building a story around it. The story says that this person is special. The story says that the emotional connection belongs only to them. But Buddhist insight invites the mind to examine how such emotional experiences actually arise. The warmth felt in those moments did not appear from the person alone. It appeared because many different conditions came together. Timing played a role. Both individuals may have been emotionally open at that moment in their lives. Their personalities may have created natural harmony in conversation. The environment may have allowed both people to relax and express themselves honestly. Shared interests may have created excitement and curiosity. All of these elements work together to produce the emotional atmosphere that felt so powerful. When these conditions align, the mind experiences connection in a very vivid way. But the conditions themselves are temporary. They are shaped by circumstances, emotional readiness, and personal growth. The mind, however, often simplifies this complex process. Instead of recognizing the many factors involved, it focuses only on the person. It assumes that the emotional experience belongs to them. This creates the illusion of a special emotional connection. The illusion feels convincing because the emotional memory remains strong. When the mind recalls those moments, the warmth appears again. The brain remembers the emotional intensity. Because the feeling returns so clearly, the mind assumes that it must have been something unique between those two individuals. But the emotional state was produced by a combination of conditions that existed during that time. If those conditions appeared again in a different context, the mind could experience similar feelings with another person. This does not diminish the beauty of the original connection. It simply reveals that emotional experiences are not owned by individuals. They arise when the right conditions appear. Buddhist philosophy often describes this principle through the idea of dependent origination. According to this understanding, every experience arises because of multiple causes and conditions. Nothing exists independently. Emotions are no exception. A feeling of closeness arises when trust exists. Trust develops when communication is honest. Honesty appears when both people feel emotionally safe. Safety grows when judgment is absent. Each element supports the next. When all of these conditions come together, a powerful emotional connection can appear. But if one condition changes, the emotional atmosphere may shift. Because the mind rarely examines these conditions, it assigns all of the emotional meaning to the person. The connection begins to feel mystical. The relationship may be described as destiny or fate. While these ideas may sound romantic, they can strengthen attachment. The mind begins believing that the emotional experience cannot exist without that specific person. This belief creates fear of loss. If the person leaves, the mind may believe that the emotional richness they brought will never return. But Buddhist insight suggests that emotional richness does not belong to a person. It belongs to the conditions that allowed the mind to open. The same emotional qualities can appear again when similar conditions arise. A new conversation with someone else may reveal a different form of understanding. A different relationship may create new emotional warmth. The mind may discover that connection can take many shapes. What once felt unique becomes recognized as one expression of a broader human capacity. This understanding also helps explain why relationships sometimes feel extraordinary at the beginning. During the early stages of connection, curiosity is strong. Both individuals are attentive. They listen carefully and respond thoughtfully. The emotional atmosphere becomes filled with interest and presence. These conditions naturally produce powerful emotional responses. But as time passes, attention may shift. Daily routines appear. Stress from life may influence communication. The emotional atmosphere changes. The mind may interpret this change as the loss of something special. But the change simply reflects the shifting of conditions. The emotional connection did not vanish because the person changed. It changed because the conditions supporting it evolved. When the mind understands this, it becomes less likely to idealize the past. Instead of believing that a single relationship contained an irreplaceable emotional magic, awareness begins to see how connection grows from the interaction between people and circumstances. This insight creates emotional freedom. The heart no longer feels trapped by the belief that the best emotional experience has already happened. It becomes open to the possibility that new conditions can create new forms of connection. Each relationship can reveal different aspects of emotional life. One person may bring laughter and excitement. Another may create deep understanding and quiet companionship. Another may inspire growth and self-discovery. Each connection becomes valuable in its own way, without needing to be compared to the past. The illusion of special emotional connections dissolves when the mind recognizes how conditions shape emotional experience. This does not make relationships less meaningful. In many ways, it makes them more precious. Instead of believing that connection belongs to fate or destiny, the mind begins appreciating the delicate balance of circumstances that allows two individuals to meet and share understanding. Every relationship becomes a temporary alignment of emotional conditions. When those conditions appear, connection arises. When they change, the emotional atmosphere transforms. Life continues, creating new possibilities for connection as circumstances evolve. This perspective also reduces the tendency to cling to one relationship as the only source of emotional fulfillment. The mind begins trusting that emotional warmth can appear again in unexpected ways. Connection becomes part of the natural movement of life rather than a rare event that happens only once. Buddhist teachings often emphasize that the world is constantly changing. Every moment creates new combinations of conditions. Because of this constant change, emotional experiences are always capable of appearing again in new forms. The mind simply needs to remain open. When the belief in special emotional ownership fades, relationships become lighter and more genuine. People are appreciated for who they are rather than for the emotional roles the mind assigns to them. Connection becomes an exploration rather than a search for a single, irreplaceable feeling. The heart learns that emotional depth does not belong to one person or one moment in time. It belongs to the living awareness that continues meeting life with openness and curiosity. And as this understanding settles quietly into the mind, attachment loosens. The past no longer appears as the only place where meaningful emotional experiences existed. Instead, it becomes one chapter in a larger story where connection continues unfolding in ways the mind has not yet discovered. As the mind slowly begins to see that emotional connections are created by conditions rather than by some mystical uniqueness between two people, another quiet misunderstanding begins to surface. Even after realizing that feelings arise from circumstances, the mind often continues holding on to a different belief. When certain emotional patterns feel deeply familiar, the mind begins interpreting that familiarity as something meaningful, almost as if life itself is guiding two people together. What is actually happening, however, is something far more psychological. The mind is recognizing a pattern it has experienced before, and because the pattern feels known, it mistakes that familiarity for destiny. There are moments when meeting someone creates a strange sense of recognition. The conversation may feel natural very quickly. Silence does not feel uncomfortable. The emotional rhythm between two people seems to move smoothly without effort. The mind notices this ease and begins forming a powerful conclusion. It may believe that the connection was meant to happen. People often describe this feeling as if they have known the other person for a long time, even though they have only just met. The sense of familiarity creates emotional comfort. Because the comfort appears so quickly, the mind begins searching for an explanation. The easiest explanation is destiny. The mind may believe that meeting this person was somehow written into the path of life. But Buddhist insight invites a deeper look into what familiarity actually means. The feeling of recognition does not come from fate. It comes from patterns the mind has experienced before. Throughout life, the brain becomes accustomed to certain emotional environments. Early relationships, family dynamics, and past experiences all shape how the mind understands connection. These experiences create emotional templates. An emotional template is a pattern the mind recognizes as familiar. When someone new enters life who behaves in ways that match one of these templates, the brain responds immediately. The interaction feels comfortable because it resembles something the mind already understands. This comfort produces the illusion of instant connection. The mind believes that the relationship must be special because it feels natural. But what feels natural is often simply what feels familiar. For example, if someone grew up in an environment where emotional closeness was expressed through deep conversation and shared vulnerability, they may feel an immediate connection with someone who communicates in the same way. The mind recognizes the emotional pattern. Because the pattern fits what the brain already understands, the interaction feels smooth and meaningful. But the feeling of recognition does not mean that the connection was destined. It simply means that the emotional pattern matches something the mind has experienced before. Sometimes this familiarity can even come from difficult emotional patterns. A person who grew up in an unpredictable environment may feel strangely drawn to relationships that recreate similar emotional tension. The pattern feels familiar, even if it is not healthy. The mind interprets the emotional intensity as meaningful because it resembles what it has known in the past. This is why certain relationships feel powerful even when they bring emotional discomfort. The brain recognizes the emotional rhythm and interprets that familiarity as a form of connection. The mind often confuses familiarity with significance. When an emotional pattern feels known, the brain assumes there must be a deeper meaning behind it. But familiarity is not the same as destiny. It is simply recognition. The mind recognizes patterns the way the body recognizes familiar movements. Because the pattern is known, the brain does not need to work as hard to understand the interaction. The emotional experience feels smooth. This smoothness can easily be mistaken for something extraordinary. Buddhist teachings often emphasize that the mind constantly interprets experiences through the lens of conditioning. Every thought, reaction, and emotional response is shaped by previous experiences. When the mind meets something that resembles a past emotional pattern, it responds quickly and automatically. This response is not guided by destiny, it is guided by conditioning. Conditioning is the accumulation of experiences that teach the mind how to react to the world. These experiences create emotional habits. When a new relationship activates one of those habits, the mind experiences a sense of recognition. But recognition is not the same as meaning. It simply indicates that the brain has encountered a similar emotional pattern before. Understanding this can change how the mind interprets powerful emotional connections. Instead of assuming that a strong sense of familiarity must mean something profound, the mind begins observing how its own conditioning shapes the experience. The connection may still be meaningful, but the meaning arises from how two individuals interact in the present rather than from the illusion that the relationship was meant to happen. This shift brings clarity. The mind becomes less likely to rush into emotional conclusions based solely on familiarity. It begins paying attention to how the relationship actually unfolds over time. True understanding develops through shared experiences, communication, and mutual growth. These elements reveal the real nature of the connection. Without this awareness, familiarity can lead the mind into repeating emotional patterns from the past. Someone may enter relationships that feel comfortable at first simply because they resemble earlier experiences. But comfort created by familiarity does not always lead to emotional well-being. The mind may unknowingly recreate patterns that limit growth. For example, if someone is accustomed to relationships where emotional availability is inconsistent, they may feel drawn to partners who display the same behavior. The pattern feels familiar. Because the mind recognizes it, the interaction appears meaningful. But the familiarity may simply reflect an old emotional template rather than a healthy connection. Recognizing this allows the mind to step back from the illusion of destiny. Instead of interpreting every strong emotional response as a sign that something profound is happening, awareness begins asking deeper questions. What patterns are being activated? What emotional habits are being repeated? What conditions are creating this sense of familiarity? By observing these patterns, the mind gains freedom from automatic reactions. Relationships become opportunities for learning rather than repetitions of past conditioning. The sense of familiarity may still appear, but it no longer controls the interpretation of the connection. The mind begins seeing that emotional patterns can be reshaped. New experiences can create new forms of familiarity. Connections that once seemed impossible can develop when different emotional environments appear. This understanding encourages openness. Instead of chasing relationships that feel instantly familiar, the mind becomes willing to explore connections that grow gradually. Some of the most meaningful relationships develop slowly because they are not built on old emotional templates. They are created through shared understanding that unfolds over time. When the illusion of destiny fades, relationships become less about fulfilling expectations and more about discovering new possibilities. The heart becomes curious rather than certain. It no longer assumes that familiarity equals meaning. Instead, it observes how emotional patterns interact with present experiences, and through this observation, the mind begins to recognize that many of the connections once believed to be destined were simply echoes of emotional habits formed long ago. With awareness, those habits can evolve. New emotional patterns can appear. Connections can grow in ways that are not limited by the past. And slowly, the mind learns that the deepest relationships are not the ones that feel instantly familiar. They are the ones that allow both individuals to grow beyond the patterns that once defined them. As the mind begins to see that emotional familiarity is often mistaken for destiny, another deeper attachment starts to reveal itself underneath all the others. Even when the mind understands that feelings arise from conditions, and even when it begins to question the stories it tells about fate and special connection, it still holds on to one final assumption with great force. It assumes that what it loves can somehow belong to it. It assumes that a person can be mine, that a feeling can be mine, that a moment can be kept. And from that assumption, a great deal of suffering quietly begins. A certain fear enters the heart the moment it starts calling something its own. The fear may be small at first, it may barely be noticed, but it grows the moment the mind says, this person is mine, this relationship is mine, this feeling belongs to me, this connection should stay with me. In that moment, love becomes mixed with possession, care becomes mixed with fear, and what once felt warm and open begins carrying the weight of anxiety. This happens because ownership sounds comforting to the mind. Ownership creates the illusion of security. When the mind says something is mine, it feels protected. It feels as though life has become more stable. The person feels closer. The relationship feels safer. The emotion feels more reliable. But Buddhism points to a very difficult truth that most people resist for a long time. Nothing in experience can truly be owned in the way the mind imagines. This does not mean that relationships are meaningless. It does not mean love is false. It means something more subtle. It means that people are living beings, not possessions. Feelings are moving conditions, not property. Moments are passing events, not objects that can be locked away. The mind, however, struggles to accept this. It wants closeness to become ownership. It wants beauty to become permanence. It wants emotional warmth to become something it can keep forever. This is where suffering begins to deepen. The moment the mind believes a person belongs to it, the relationship changes internally. The other person is no longer simply being met as they are. They begin carrying the weight of the mind's expectations. They must remain close. They must continue behaving in ways that maintain emotional comfort. They must not change too much. They must not leave. They must not stop producing the emotional atmosphere the mind has become attached to. The person becomes silently responsible for preserving what the mind wants to keep. But no human being can carry that responsibility forever. People change, their moods change, their priorities shift, their understanding of themselves evolves, their emotional life moves. Even when two people deeply care for each other, neither one can remain frozen in the exact form the other mind has grown attached to. Yet, attachment often tries to do exactly that. It tries to hold a living person still inside a fixed emotional image. Buddhist thought examines this through the idea of emptiness, not as a cold or hopeless truth, but as a liberating one. Emptiness means that things do not possess the solid, separate, permanent essence the mind projects onto them. A person is not a fixed object. A relationship is not a stable possession. An emotion is not a permanent substance. Each of these exists through changing causes and conditions. Each of them is fluid. Each of them depends on countless influences. The mind suffers because it keeps treating what is fluid as if it were solid. A person cannot truly belong to you because there is no fixed thing there to own. There is a changing body, a changing mind, changing memories, changing moods, changing desires, changing fears, changing forms of understanding. The person you speak to today is not exactly the same inner arrangement that existed a year ago. Even your own sense of self is moving in this way all the time. So when the mind says this person is mine, it is clinging not to reality, but to an imagined stability that never truly existed. The same is true of emotion. People often speak as though certain feelings belong to them or belong to the relationship. my happiness, my peace, our connection, our love. But if you watch carefully, you begin to notice that feelings do not stay still long enough to be owned. They arise, they intensify, they soften, they vanish, they return in altered form. They depend on sleep, memory, stress, timing, attention, physical health, words spoken, words not spoken, and countless other conditions. Something so fluid cannot be possessed. It can be experienced, it can be appreciated, it can be responded to, but it cannot be owned. Yet the mind insists otherwise because ownership creates emotional comfort. To say this person is mine feels stronger than saying this person is currently sharing life with me. To say this happiness is mine feels more secure than saying this warmth is present right now. Ownership gives the illusion of control. It suggests that what is loved can be defended against change. But life does not obey that illusion. Change enters anyway. Distance appears anyway. Emotions shift anyway. And when they do, the mind feels robbed, as though something was taken from it. This sense of being robbed is one of the clearest signs that the mind was living inside the fantasy of ownership. When someone leaves, the pain is often intensified by the unspoken belief that they were not supposed to. When emotional warmth fades, the suffering increases because the mind believes that feeling should have remained available. The grief is not only about absence, it is also about the collapse of imagined possession. That is why relationships can produce so much hidden tension even while they seem loving on the surface. Underneath affection, the mind is often bargaining with reality. Stay this way, stay close, stay emotionally available, stay mine. It may never say these words directly, but they exist in subtler forms. The fear of abandonment, the jealousy that appears when attention shifts elsewhere, the panic when communication changes, the hurt when someone no longer reflects back the version of ourselves we wanted confirmed. All of these reactions reveal the same hidden assumption. The mind believed it had some form of ownership over what could never actually be owned. Buddhist insight does not respond to this by telling the heart to stop loving. It responds by asking the heart to love more truthfully, to love without turning the other person into property, to care without trying to imprison change, to appreciate emotion without trying to trap it in time. This is a different kind of love from the one most people are taught. It is less dramatic in one sense, but deeper in another. It does not depend on possession. It depends on presence. Presence says, I am here with you while this moment exists. Ownership says, you must remain here for me because I have attached my security to your presence. Presence appreciates. Ownership grasps. Presence can feel grief when something ends, but it does not build its entire world on the assumption that nothing should end. Ownership resists ending with all its force, and that resistance creates a second layer of suffering on top of the natural sadness of change. This can be seen even in ordinary, daily interactions. A conversation goes well, and the mind wants the closeness it produced to continue unchanged. A beautiful evening is shared, and the mind immediately begins turning it into something to preserve. A person expresses affection, and the mind silently records it as something that should remain available. By the next day, if the atmosphere shifts, disappointment appears. Why? Because the mind has already converted a living moment into a kind of emotional possession. It is almost as if the mind is constantly trying to collect evidence that life is stable enough to rely on in permanent ways. But life keeps answering differently. It keeps showing that everything moves. Even the most beautiful relationships are not static objects. They are ongoing conversations between changing beings. The moment the mind forgets this and begins claiming ownership, the relationship becomes heavier than it needs to be. There is also a deeper layer to this teaching. The mind does not only try to own other people, it tries to own versions of itself that appeared inside relationships. It may say, I was better with them, I was happier with them. I was more alive with them. In this way, the mind tries to possess an emotional self-image created in a certain period of life. Then when that period ends, it feels as though a part of the self has been stolen. But even this is another form of empty ownership. That version of you was also a changing process, a rising through conditions. It was never a solid possession. It was a temporary expression of a certain emotional environment. When this becomes clear, a more spacious understanding begins to appear. The person was never yours, but they were real. The feeling was never yours, but it was real. The moment could never be kept, but it was real. Buddhism does not ask you to deny the reality of experience. It asks you to stop demanding ownership over what is by nature passing and interdependent. This understanding can sound painful at first because the mind thinks ownership is what makes love meaningful. But ownership is not what makes love meaningful. In many cases, ownership is what distorts love. What gives love depth is not possession but contact. It is the fact that two lives truly met for a time. That understanding was shared, that warmth appeared, that something beautiful arose from conditions and touched the heart. That is enough. It does not need to become permanent property in order to matter. In fact, the inability to own something often makes it more precious, not less. A sunset cannot be possessed, yet it can move the heart deeply. Music cannot be held in the hand, yet it can transform a moment of life. A conversation cannot be stored forever, yet it can stay meaningful for years. Meaning does not come from possession. It comes from presence, depth, and awareness. The mind forgets this when it becomes attached. It assumes that what matters must belong to it. But this is not how life works. Once the mind starts to release this habit, relationships begin to breathe differently. There is more space inside them. Less fear, less silent pressure, less panic when emotions move naturally. The other person is no longer being unconsciously asked to guarantee emotional permanence. They are allowed to be a changing human being, and you are allowed to be one too. This does not remove pain from life, but it removes the unnecessary suffering caused by trying to possess what was never possessible. It also changes the way loss is understood. When a relationship ends, grief can still be real. Missing someone can still be real. Sadness can still move through the body and mind. But beneath that sadness, there is less of the feeling that something was unjustly taken. There is more clarity, more truth, more recognition that what was shared was never property. It was a chapter, a meeting of conditions, a living experience, real, meaningful, beautiful perhaps, but not ownable. This insight softens many hidden emotional battles. Jealousy begins to loosen because the mind sees that no human being can be possessed in the first place. Anxiety begins to loosen because the mind sees that emotional states cannot be kept by force. The desperate urge for reassurance begins to soften because the mind stops treating love as a contract guaranteeing permanent emotional access. Instead of demanding certainty from life, the heart learns to meet uncertainty with greater honesty. And from this honesty, a surprising tenderness can emerge. When you stop trying to own someone, you can finally see them more clearly. You begin to notice their freedom, their vulnerability, their separate inner world, their changing nature. Love becomes less about what they give you and more about the simple truth that their life touched yours. That is a quieter kind of love, but often a purer one. The same is true for your own feelings. When you stop trying to possess them, you stop panicking every time they change. Joy can appear without needing to be captured. Peace can arise without needing to be secured forever. Longing can move through the heart without being turned into a story of permanent lack. Emotions become weather rather than property. They pass through awareness, shaping experience for a time, then moving on. This makes life less rigid and more alive. The mind will still try to return to ownership again and again. It will still say my person, my feeling, my connection, my loss. These habits are deeply human. But each time they are seen clearly, their grip weakens a little. Each time the mind recognizes that ownership is empty, it becomes less trapped by fear. It starts relating to experience with open hands rather than clenched fists. That is where freedom begins. Not in detachment as cold distance, but in detachment as truthful intimacy. The ability to love without claiming, to feel without imprisoning, to remember without trying to drag the past into permanent form, to let life be shared rather than possessed. And when this understanding settles more deeply into the heart, something profound changes in the way attachment is experienced. What once felt like love mixed with fear begins to separate. The fear belongs to ownership. The love does not need it. The fear belongs to grasping. The love can survive without it. The fear says, do not change, do not leave, do not take this away from me. The love says, thank you for being here while this moment was alive. That shift may seem small at first, but it changes everything. Because the moment the mind stops insisting that people and feelings belong to it, it begins to experience them more clearly, more gently, and with far less suffering. What remains is not emptiness in the ordinary sense of loss. It is emptiness in the Buddhist sense of freedom from false possession. A freedom that allows life to move, relationships to breathe, feelings to rise and fall, and the heart to stay open without needing to own what it loves. As you slowly come to the end of this journey, something important begins to become clear. What the mind often believes is missing is not always the person. It is the emotional atmosphere that once existed around them, the calm that appeared in certain conversations, the warmth that existed in shared silence, the feeling of being understood, safe, or emotionally alive. These were real experiences, but they were never owned by another person. They arose from conditions, from timing, from openness, from the meeting of two changing minds within a particular moment of life. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that attachment is rarely about people alone. It is about the feelings that the mind learned to associate with them. Memory holds the emotional tone, craving amplifies it, and loneliness sometimes pulls the mind back toward it. Yet through every lesson in this journey, one quiet truth keeps appearing again and again. Emotions live inside the mind. They arise, they pass, and they can appear again under new conditions. What once felt like something that belonged to someone else was actually a reflection of your own capacity to feel deeply. And when the mind begins to see this clearly, something changes. The past stops feeling like the only place where meaning existed. The heart begins to understand that connection, warmth, and emotional depth are not locked inside one person or one moment in time. They are possibilities that continue moving through life, waiting for new conditions to bring them forward again. If something in these reflections spoke to you tonight, leave a comment below and share one insight that stayed with you. Sometimes the words we leave behind can help someone else understand their own heart a little more clearly. And if you want more reflections like this that help quiet the mind and bring deeper understanding to life, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next journey inward.